Chapter 288, Beardy, 2. When Chu Lian finally dragged her savior inside, the rain still hadn't stopped. She found that she had used up all the strength left inside her. Chu Lian leaned against the cave wall and tried to catch her breath. She gave herself a short break to recover before looking out towards the cave entrance. Judging by the color of the sky, it seemed like it was almost dusk. Chu Lian glared at the man lying next to her. There was no other choice. She could only muster up her willpower and drag her fatigued body to go out and gather firewood. The temperature in the forest dipped heavily at night. Even though they had already found shelter, they would surely freeze to death without a fire. Furthermore, their clothes were now soaked through thanks to the rain. If they wanted to keep warm, they would have to use the fire to dry their clothes first. Unfortunately, the dried leaves and branches on the forest floor had been drenched by the rain. It was going to be hard to find kindling. Chu Lian spent another lifetime of strength before she finally found some dry branches and leaves in a mountain pass. She stored them in her skirt like a basket and hurried back to the cave. The sky quickly turned dark. By the time Chu Lian reached the cave, the last trace of light had disappeared. It was so dark that she couldn't see her fingers in front of her face. Chu Lian sniffled and carefully placed the branches to one side. She started feeling around the rocks nearby. When she found the flints that she had hidden here earlier, she sighed in relief. With the flints in hand, she rubbed them together and finally managed to set the small pile of kindling on fire. A warm glow suffused the inside of the dark cave. Looking at the warm, dancing flames before her, Chu Lian could finally stop worrying. At the same time that she set her burdens down, her stomach began to gurgle. Chu Lian was surprised by the sound. It was only then that she recalled that she hadn't eaten anything at all apart from a few sips of honey water. She checked her waist and found that her snack pouch was still there. Fortunately, there was still her beef jerky inside, though it was a little wet from the rain. Chu Lian took one piece out for herself before counting how many remained. Her head turned to look at the comatose man lying by the fire. She sighed and swallowed the delicious beef jerky in her mouth before looking back to her pouch regretfully. In the end, she closed it up and tucked it away. This was all the food she had on her, and there was still a sick man here to take care of. It would be better to keep the food for him first. As for herself, when it was day again, she was going to go out into the forest to look for edible fruits. Chu Lian checked the temperature of the man's forehead again before chewing up the remaining herbs she had found and applying them to the man's wound. When she checked its progress, it seemed like the skin around the wound had regained its normal color, so the herbs had worked. With this bit of news, another burden lifted off Chu Lian's heart and she took the time to dry off her clothes. When she touched the man's clothes and found that they were wet too, Chu Lian looked down at the bearded face of the man and gritted her teeth. In the end, she still reached out and removed the man's armor and clothes to dry them by the fire. Chu Lian stared dazedly at the man's lean and muscled upper body after taking off his clothes. Her gaze traveled down from the man's neck to his 8-pack abs. She awkwardly swallowed some drool that had pooled in her mouth. Upon coming to her senses, Chu Lian realized that she had lost control of herself and quickly averted her gaze. She mumbled under her breath, "He looked so tall and skinny on the outside. Who could have thought that he would have such fine goods hidden beneath his clothes?" Then, she stuck her tongue out at the comatose man to hide her own embarrassment. What Chu Lian didn't know was that Changdi still retained some awareness despite his coma. He had heard every bit of her backhanded compliment towards him. Chapter 289, Spending the Night Together, 3. By the time her clothes were almost dried, Chu Lian had already yawned several times in succession as she waited by the fire. This whole day had just been too tiring for her. She had ridden a horse, escaped the Tuhuns, fallen off a cliff, stumbled around an unknown mountain forest, been pelted with icy winter rain, somehow managed to drag herself and this big, burly military officer to shelter. It hadn't been easy holding up to this point. Chu Lian had used up her entire store of energy, and she didn't even have enough food to replenish it at the end of the day. She placed her cloak on the ground next to the fire. Afraid that her savior would freeze, she had moved him closer to the fire, too. After checking his temperature by touching his forehead, Chu Lian set down her worries and laid on her cloak, finally shutting her eyes for a well-deserved rest. He Sanlang first felt a piercing pain in his head when he woke up. Next, his thick eyelashes trembled as he struggled to open his eyes. He tried to move his arm and felt the prickling of pins and needles in response. He frowned with difficulty and shifted his gaze. In the next instant, his entire body stiffened up. Chu Lian. Her eyelashes fanned out like butterfly wings as they rested over her closed eyelids. There was a slight pout on her face as she drew in long, shallow breaths. From the upward curve of her lips, it was clear that she was in the midst of deep slumber. One of her hands was curled over her heart while the other was placed on his chest. Her body was curled up in the crook of his arm and she was stuck to him like a leech. He Changdis' expression turned stormy and he subconsciously reached out to push the clingy Chu Lian away. However, when he caught sight of that familiar woman's cloak from the corner of his eye and realized that more than half of it was draped over his body, the hand that was in the midst of reaching out to push her stopped. The memories of everything Chu Lian had done for him after he had gotten injured drifted up into his consciousness. The depths of He Sanlang's eyes turned unreadable as his gaze landed on Chu Lian's porcelain-white face. Had things changed in this lifetime? Had this wicked woman's personality changed completely? Otherwise, why would she have spent so much effort to save him when it was such a good opportunity to get rid of him? Wasn't abandoning him to die more in line with her goals? A multitude of feelings churned together in He Changdis' heart. Even though he was looking at the exact same face of his tormentor from his past life, he could feel that his feelings towards this person had changed. He Changdis' lips pursed together. The right hand hovering in midair finally moved towards the cloak. He tugged more of the makeshift blanket over Chu Lian, covering up her dainty little form. The arm placed under Chu Lian's neck was starting to go numb, but He Sanlang didn't move it away. He simply raised his arm a little and moved Chu Lian closer to him so she could be more comfortable. For some reason, even though this was an insignificant action between a married couple, there was a trace of satisfaction in the depths of He Sanlang's heart. While in the midst of her deep slumber, Chu Lian was starting to feel a little chilly in the middle of the night, so she flipped herself around. When her arm touched something warm, her body unconsciously wriggled towards that warmth. As expected, after obtaining a source of warmth, she was able to drift back into a comfortable sleep. After an unknown amount of time, Chu Lian slowly regained consciousness. She realized that she was being held by a strong arm, and her nose was filled with a rather masculine smell. It was mixed with the slightly moldy scent of damp earth and the rotting leaves of the forest floor. The smell wasn't pleasant at all, but she felt strangely reassured by its presence. Chapter 290, Spending the Night Together. 4. Chu Lian wasn't a morning person. When she opened her eyes, her head was still fuzzy and she completely forgot where she was. When she looked up, a pale, sickly-looking face with fine features covered by a great beard met her eyes. Actually, this man had a pretty good-looking face. Furthermore, from his smooth, unwrinkled skin, she could tell that he was rather young. The imposing set of armor and the black tunic underneath it made him look like a strong and mighty man. His presence made all those around him feel safe. Oh, this was the beardy who had saved her. The nice guy who had helped her out of that pickle with the 2 hoons. Back then, Chu Lian thought that would be the end of the line for her. However, this man had pulled her into his protective embrace even in such a precarious situation, and he even fell down the cliff together with her without a care for his own life. As Chu Lian thought back to those moments, she was suffused with a feeling of safety. Chu Lian was about to burrow deeper into this warm and safe embrace, but before she could, she abruptly recalled who she was. She was a married woman, House Jingan's third young madam, He Sanlang's wife. Her husband was that crazy He Changdi who always had strange requests for her and an eternally gloomy face. It was as if she had been doused in ice-cold water. Chu Lian had never been more awake in her life. Chu Lian yanked back her hand as if she had been burned. She felt that there still wasn't clear enough of a boundary between them, so she reached out to push the man away and keep him at arm's length. Chu Lian crawled up from the ground with her head lowered to hide her flushed face. Torn with herself, she said, "Excuse me, mister. Although I'm very grateful that you've saved my life, you can't use this chance to take advantage of me." Ha! He Sanlang's originally warm expression immediately turned into the stormiest one he could summon. Just now, he had been enjoying the fluttering warmth in his heart as he watched Chu Lian lie in his arms so trustingly. He had still been taken aback that this wicked woman had such a lovely and endearing side to her. However, when he thought back to how he had saved her without reservation previously, it was normal that she would fall in love with him. Furthermore, they were husband and wife, so this level of intimacy was a given. As strict as the customs of the Great Wu dynasty were, this much was still acceptable between a married couple. Completely out of his expectations, in this warm and loving moment, that wicked woman Chu Lian had actually blurted out something to kill the mood completely. He Sanlang's body went stiff from shock. He stared at her with his eyes an unfathomable black. Within those depths, a storm was brewing. He Changdi wasn't stupid. Of course, he had understood the meaning behind Chu Lian's words. This wicked woman. He had risked his life to save her and she hadn't recognized him. Outrageous. Did she really think that he wouldn't dare to punish her? How could Chu Lian have expected this crude-looking, strong young man with a beard to turn out to be her own husband? Actually, Chu Lian really wasn't to blame here. The day of their wedding had been their first meeting. On their wedding night, He Sanlang had threatened Chu Lian and had only ever shown her his crazy side thereafter. Chu Lian was a normal person, she wasn't a masochist. After getting treated like that by her newlywed husband, even if He Changdi were to look like a deity descended onto the mortal plane, she refused to look at him any more than she had to. Coupled with He Sanlang's unwarranted enmity and how he shunned her, it was impossible for Chu Lian to believe that He Changdi would risk his own life to save her. He Changdi had earned the nickname of He Sanlang the Fair back in the capital. His looks were really fine and fair. Now that he had a beard obscuring half his face, there was just too much of a difference between his appearance back then to now. Any other person wouldn't be able to recognize him either, let alone Chu Lian. Chu Lian just hadn't spent enough time with He Sanlang, so it was understandable that she hadn't managed to recognize him. Chapter 291, Spending the Night Together, 5. When Chu Lian saw that the man before her was just staring at her in complete silence, she thought that she hadn't made herself clear. She pressed her dry lips together and put a little more thought into her words. Then, she said, "Mister, I have to be frank with you. I'm already married." The undercurrent of her words was that, even if he had feelings towards her, he should give them up and keep his distance. He Sanlang almost puked blood. He was so angry that he felt tendrils of pain stabbing his head. However, after hearing Chu Lian declare her marital status, he was also relieved. At least this wicked woman still remembered her place and how important her good name and reputation were. She wasn't trying to seduce other men and make a cuckold out of him. However, before He Sanlang even had the time to relax, Chu Lian's next words gave him the urge to strangle her. Chu Lian had carefully observed the man's expression before continuing to speak. She coughed gently to dispel the awkward atmosphere. "I'm very grateful that you saved me under those circumstances. Judging by the look of your armor, you must be one of the soldiers in the Liangju border troops. My husband's also in the same army. He might even be your superior, and with that weird temperament of his, if he finds out that you've taken advantage of me, he might even decide to cut your hands off." He Changdi sneered inwardly and added his own line at the end. If someone really dared to touch Chu Lian, he wouldn't just stop at chopping off the adulterer's hands. His gaze turned cold when it landed on Chu Lian's own soft, white hands, which were tightly clenched in her clothes. His half-lidded eyes concealed his cold expression from Chu Lian's notice. She thought that she had reminded the man before her of the stakes and huffed a little in relief. "Actually, I don't blame you at all. This cave is cold and chilly and you were both poisoned and injured yesterday. You were having a high fever, so it's understandable that you did something like that. Since you were so kind-hearted as to save a stranger you had never met before, I'm sure your character is trustworthy. However, there aren't that many good people in the world and mouths talk. However, since we're the only ones who know about us spending the night together, as long as you don't say anything after we leave this place, then my good name will be safe. It's not easy to be a woman and you surely have a mother or a few sisters. Surely you can sympathize with my plight." When she was done speaking, Chu Lian stared at him innocently with her pair of big, almond-shaped eyes. as if she would keep staring at him for all eternity if the man before her didn't agree. He Sanlang's expression was already dark. He was close to choking on his anger and had the urge to discipline her. However, when she looked at him with those puppy eyes, his heart couldn't help but soften. However, he did have quite a bit of anger in him still. He had risked his life to save her, but she hadn't recognized him as her husband at all. Any other man would be feeling the exact same way in his position. He Sanlang was on the verge of falling into depression. He didn't want to reveal his identity immediately. He wanted to see what other outrageous words would come out of this wife of his and exactly how slow she was. When was she going to realize his true identity? A mischievous sort of anticipation bubbled up in his heart. He wondered what expression Chu Lian would have when she finally realized that strange and savage husband she was speaking of was right in front of her. He Sanlang suppressed the resentment in his heart and kept the twitching of his lips under control before nodding slightly. When Chu Lian saw that he had agreed to her request, she heaved a long sigh of relief. She stood up and straightened out the cloak on the floor before saying, "Of course, I won't forget the debt I owe you for saving my life. From now on, if you meet any difficulty, you can come and look for me. I'll do my best as long as it's something within my capabilities." Chapter 292, Spending the Night Together, 6. He Chang's condition had gotten much better. However, his fever hadn't broken completely, although it was still better than yesterday. When he heard Chu Lian's words, a corner of his lips lifted up. His tone was full of disdain as he replied, "What can a person like you help me with?" Chu Lian turned to him with an unhappy frown. "Well, who knows what'll happen in the future? How do you know that I won't be able to help you? I can even help you right now. Wait here, I'll go and find something to eat." He Sanlang turned towards the cave entrance. The rain had stopped, and there was a thick layer of snow on top of the dried grass outside the cave. He snorted inwardly. With this sort of bitterly cold weather in the middle of a mountain forest, it was going to be impossible for a weak little girl like Chu Lian to find anything edible. Chu Lian had been watching He Chang's expression, so she immediately noticed the disbelief and contempt on his face, which provoked her stubborn temper. Her cheeks puffed up as she said angrily, "Sit here and don't move. I'll be back soon." Then, Chu Lian took her big cloak with her as she quickly walked out of the cave. When she reached the entrance, the cold air immediately forced her sleepy mind to wake up all at once. Somewhat disturbed, Chu Lian shook her head and stomped her foot. What had gotten into her? Why was she so easily provoked by that beardy? He hadn't even really said anything to her, and here she was, all ready to go out and look for food by herself. But now that she had already left the cave, she couldn't just return empty-handed. Wouldn't that just make her die of embarrassment? Chu Lian sighed and tried to calm herself down. She accepted her fate and picked a random direction before trudging off into the woods. After walking for some time, the scene in the cave played in her mind again. That beard's voice seemed strangely familiar, as if she had heard it somewhere before. However, she couldn't recall exactly where. Chu Lian shook her head and set that matter aside. There were so many people who looked alike in this world, it wasn't a surprise if there were people who sounded the same, too. After reassuring herself, Chu Lian stopped thinking about it. He Changdi watched as Chu Lian's slender figure disappear from sight. Only then did his stiff body untense in relief. He looked up at the uneven surface of the cave wall, thoughts hidden in the unreadable depths of his eyes. However, after a short moment, he suddenly stood up. Due to his abrupt movement, he felt a wave of dizziness crash over his head, and he couldn't help but stumble. He Changdi immediately grabbed onto the cave wall for balance and shut his eyes. After resting for a while, his body felt better. Although He Sanlang's condition had improved since yesterday, he was still poisoned and feverish. The remaining toxins hadn't been cleared from his system yet, so his body was still weak. Actually, he was in very frail health right now, but when he thought of how Chu Lian had gone into the woods all by herself, he couldn't rest easy. Who knew if those crafty Tuhuns were still out there in the forest? What if Chu Lian encountered them? Even if there weren't Tuhuns around, the forest was a dangerous place in winter. He had risked his life to save Chu Lian's, so if anything happened to her now, wouldn't all his previous efforts go to waste? He Sanlang's expression was as gloomy as ever. He couldn't stop thinking about everything that could go wrong, and so he used this twisted reasoning to cover up the concern he felt for Chu Lian. He Changdi bore with the weakness of his body and left the cave. He quickly found a place to leave a distress signal for his subordinates to find, and then began to track Chu Lian's footprints to follow after her. Chapter 293, Don't Move, 1. As Chu Lian shivered from the cold, hugging her arms to herself, she began to realize how silly her decision to rush out to look for food was. The mountain forest in the midst of winter was a desolate place. Piercing cold winds battered her body as they raced through the gaps between the trees, as if nature was trying to steal the last vestiges of warmth away from her. From time to time, the black crows perching on the branches above would caw mockingly in her general direction, sending chills down her spine. This area was close to the northern border where there was already a lack of natural resources. It was even harder to find food in the winter. Although Chu Lian knew a little about survival in the wilderness, she had never experienced a terrible environment like this before. Chu Lian looked into the bleak forest and smiled bitterly to herself. She had really stuck her foot into her mouth. If she had known it would be like this earlier, she wouldn't have tried to boast about her ability. However, since she had come out of the cave, she had to give it her best shot. If she was lucky, she might find some pine cones on the ground. As it turned out, she really wasn't all that lucky after all, especially when she was around He Sanlang. He Changdi had been too worried to let Chu Lian go out alone, so he had gone looking for her by following her tracks. However, before he had even found her, he first heard a familiar scream. He Changdi's pupils shrunk. He sprinted towards the direction the scream had come from without care for the current state of his body. When he finally found that troublemaking woman lying helplessly on a pile of fallen leaves not too far away, He Sanlang's high-strung nerves slowly relaxed again. However, when he caught sight of the pitiful expression on Chu Lian's face, like she was trying to stay strong as she struggled with a great amount of pain, a mysterious burst of anger flared up within him. He clenched his fists and took in a deep breath before he managed to get his rage under control. However, this action made his features look even more chilly. His long legs carried him over to Chu Lian's side in a few strides. In an icy voice, he asked, "What's wrong?" When Chu Lian heard the sound of footsteps behind her, she turned around in surprise. Her shock at seeing her bearded savior was so great that she nearly forgot her pain as she stuttered, "Why did you come out?" He Sanlang didn't want to answer her question at all. He lowered his gaze and looked at the right leg she was holding. Chu Lian was already feeling a little guilty. When he refused to give her a reply and his expression turned even uglier, she followed his line of sight and found out what he was looking at. Chu Lian immediately pulled the hem of her skirt down and tried to give some sort of excuse. "It's nothing, just an accidental sprain." When there was still no hint of a reply from the beardy, Chu Lian couldn't hold still. She looked up and glanced at him with that one look. She was scared stiff by the hair-raising frostiness in his eyes. The hand holding her skirt hem down subconsciously loosened. He Sanlang looked down on her from above. His sharp eyes noticed the flash of red on her leg that had previously been hidden by her light green skirt. He Changdi's eyes narrowed and he quickly squatted down. He pulled aside her hands and lifted up the hem. When he saw that her slender right leg had been caught in the jaws of a menacing steel bear trap, the intensity of his gaze could almost light a fire. "So this is a mere sprain. Well done." Although his voice was usually magnetic and soothing, it was now coated in icicles, making Chu Lian shiver in fright. Chu Lian hadn't expected him to move so quickly. He had also ignored the customary distance between opposite genders and flipped up her skirt just like that. How could this beardy be so horrid? Chapter 294, Don't Move, 2. Chu Lian had already been feeling both ashamed and aggrieved at the same time, a mix of feelings that made her feel like she might implode at any moment. Without her noticing, even her ears had flushed red with embarrassment. However, when she heard his mocking reprimand, she just couldn't muster up any energy to retort. It's not like she wanted to step on this trap. It's not her fault. Okay. Dejected, Chu Lian defended herself, in her mind. In actual fact, her external appearance and internal thoughts were completely opposite. Her head was lowered, her long eyelashes trembling as they covered her eyes like little fans. She looked extremely pitiful, like she was afraid of getting scolded. However, Sanlang's determination to reprimand her hadn't decreased one bit despite the guilt and self-blame she was demonstrating. He harumphed inwardly. This wicked woman was too used to acting pitiful. Chu Lian snatched the hem of her skirt from his hands and covered up her legs. You! How could you do that? Changdi's gloom and doom hadn't dissipated at all. His voice turned harder and colder as he disregarded Chu Lian's retort and warned, "Move your hands away." A fire had been stoked in Chu Lian's heart thanks to this man's icy, forceful attitude. Her cheeks puffed up and she met his eyes directly in a spurt of courage. "Mister, men and women should keep their distance. I can do it myself." After saying so, Chu Lian pulled down her skirt tightly before glaring up at the bearded man, her eyes full of stubborn determination. Sanlang was instantly filled with anger. Heh! Men and women should keep their distance. She was trying to use that silly rule on her own husband. Very well. Then he was going to see how capable this wicked woman was today. Changdi released her ankle and stood up. He walked off to one side and even turned his back towards her a little, as if just the distance wasn't enough. He also had to avert his gaze. Without that beardy staring at her, Chu Lian was much more relaxed since she no longer felt so on edge. She sneaked a peek in the beard's direction, only to see that his tall back was ramrod straight. After making sure that he really wasn't looking this way anymore, she reached out to pull aside the cloth covering her trapped ankle. Just that slight movement of her body pained her enough that she sucked in her breath. Her attention had been drawn away by that beardy earlier. It was only now when she looked at her wound that the pain returned with double or triple the force. She slowly shifted into a more comfortable position before she tried to pry the bear trap apart using her hands. However, she quickly realized that this bear trap wasn't as easy to open as it first seemed to be. Since her ankle was trapped, she couldn't really use all of her strength. Furthermore, the bear trap was clamped on too tightly. She tried a few more times, but the trap was unmovable. Conversely, she had become fatigued from her exertions and the pain she was suffering. She kept sucking in her breath due to the pain. Her gaze hesitantly turned to the bearded man not too far away. She wanted to ask for his help, but when she thought back to how she had refused his help earlier, she just couldn't set down her pride to do so. Chu Lian scolded herself in her mind in her frustration. Although Sanlang was standing to one side and pretending not to care, he had been watching Chu Lian from the corner of his eyes. He watched as that tiny yet stubborn figure gritted her teeth while trying to pry off the bear trap, her eyelashes already wet with tears from her struggles. Those little hands, reddened from the cold, were gripping the two sides of the bear trap so fiercely that her knuckles had turned white. However, that steel trap remained clamped onto her leg without budging. In the end, she weakly let go of the trap. Her leg was still caught in it, and all she had to show for her efforts was more blood seeping out from her wound. The knot in Changdi's heart tightened and he could no longer continue standing still. He berated himself for striking a compromise with her and forgetting his original purpose. He ignored all of the wicked woman's protests and grabbed hold of Chu Lian's hands with one of his arms. He stuck so close to her that he could feel her breath ghosting over his face. When he spoke, his slightly husky voice carried an undertone of restraint as he warned her and said, "Don't move, or you'll never use this leg of yours again." Chapter 295, Shameless Man, 1. Chu Lian had been scared stiff thanks to the initial anger in the bearded man's shout. This time, she really did keep completely still, not daring to move a single inch. However, in the next second, Chu Lian realized that there was another layer behind the beard's cold words. Hidden beneath the anger was a sense of concern for her well-being. She blinked at him with wide, innocent eyes. Chu Lian wasn't a person who didn't appreciate kindness. Since someone else had already taken the initiative to help her, she wasn't going to reject his help. If she really rejected his help again, she wouldn't just be stupid, she would be courting death. Right now, the two of them were so close that Chu Lian could see each individual eyelash on his eyes. What did a man need such long and lovely eyelashes for? Although half of his face had been obscured by his beard, she could still tell that underneath all that hair, his features were quite fine. His side profile was especially beautiful with his tall nose bridge, long and narrow eyes, and slightly pale lips. Chu Lian's interest in seeing what he looked like under that beard was growing. After He Sanlang had stopped Chu Lian from moving, he bent down and used both of his hands to pull open the steel trap before carefully lifting her thin ankle out of the cold metal jaws. Without any particular expression on his face, He Sanlang asked, "So why aren't you talking about keeping a distance between men and women now?" The tiny bit of goodwill that he had accumulated in Chu Lian's heart after handling her injured ankle so gently was completely swept away by that one question. Chu Lian's face was flushed red with anger. However, she couldn't scold him, either, since she had been in the wrong for being too stubborn earlier. On the other hand, if this beardy hadn't provoked her with his cold words, how could she have acted so rashly? He Changdi watched as the wicked woman's cheeks turned pink with frustration and her originally wide eyes turned watery, making her look like a little fawn that needed reassurance. She was surely hopping mad within, but she couldn't find any excuse to vent it out on him. The thought soothed the frustrations in his heart, making his icy expression warm up a little. As He Sanlang continued looking at Chu Lian, who was squatting on a dry log, she pouted and turned her head away, intent on sulking. His eyes landed on her injured ankle once again. He hesitated for a moment before squatting down and turning his back to her. When Chu Lian caught sight of his strange action, she immediately grew alert. "What are you doing?" He Sanlang swept a profound gaze over her before stating, "Get on." "Get on? On what?" It was only when Chu Lian looked at his broad back that she finally realized what he wanted. Was he going to piggyback her all the way back? The fading blush on her cheeks was reignited once again. This wasn't much back in the modern world, it would just be seen as a kind and helpful gesture. However, she was in the Great Wu dynasty right now. The most intimate action she had shared with her husband, He Sanlang, had just been to sleep in the same bed. That had been with separate blankets, too. How could she crawl onto a stranger's back just like that? And this beardy kept a gloomy expression on all day. He probably wasn't a nice guy at all. He might even be harboring some bad intentions. Chu Lian remained silent, intending for a soundless protest. He Changdis' brows furrowed. "Clearly unhappy," he said, "so you don't want me to carry you? Are you going to walk all the way back yourself?" After he finished speaking, he stood up and loomed over Chu Lian with his height. Chu Lian felt really embarrassed. Every time this beardy opened his mouth, he never failed to aggravate her. She was going to curse this stupid man to a lifetime of solitude. Chu Lian tried to stand up by herself, but her ankle injury was too severe. She began to teeter and instantly fell back down. Chu Lian was on the verge of tears. She couldn't put any weight on her right leg. "Do you still want to go back on your own in this condition?" He Sanlang snorted. "You have two choices. Either stay here to feed the wild beasts, or let me carry you back obediently." Chapter 296, Shameless Man, 2. Chu Lian wasn't the kind to give in to pressure, and she was both stubborn and proud to the bone. As the saying went, you can change mountains and rivers, but not a person's nature. If He Sanlang talked to her nicely, she wasn't an unreasonable person. However, the more someone provoked her, the more stubborn she became. When she looked up and saw the man standing there, arms crossed like his word was the law, her temper flared up. Was there really no other way to get back to the cave than let him carry her? Be carried by this arrogant man? She refused. Chu Lian just wouldn't accept his help today. She puffed up her cheeks and said, "I'll let the wild beasts have me, then." He Sanlang's eyes lit up with flames when he heard her reply. If this was one of his subordinates back in camp, he would have kicked them by now. Unfortunately, the person stoking his rage was Chu Lian. He had originally intended to lessen her suffering wherever he could. However, this stupid woman was scorning his kindness and choosing to suffer instead. The depths of He Changdis' eyes darkened. The words that came out of his mouth were like daggers as he laughed mockingly. "You keep bringing up the distance that men and women should keep, but don't you think it's a little late? We've already spent the night together. Don't forget where you woke up this morning." Chu Lian hadn't thought that this beardy would talk so brazenly in front of her. Her anger reached its peak. Without thinking twice about it, she shouted, "I thought he Sanlang was already shameless and cold enough. You're even more shameless than he is." Upon coming to her senses, Chu Lian was flooded with regret. What was going on with her? Why was her temper flaring up so much when around this beardy? She had even spoken before thinking. Where had her calm composure gone? They were all alone out here in the wilderness. If he had any untoward intentions, she was going to be the losing party. Furthermore, her leg was already injured. She was like a fish on a chopping block. Buried in her upset reflection, Chu Lian didn't dare look up at the beardless expression. Her lips parted with the desire to apologize, but in the next second, she felt herself getting picked up and thrown across broad shoulders. The movement was too sudden. By the time she could react, her body was already on his shoulders. She could feel a strain in her abdomen, and it was even more uncomfortable for her dangling head. One of his arms wrapped around the back of her knees while another hand held onto her ankles. He warned her coolly, "Don't move, or he'll throw you off." Since she was being hung upside down, Chu Lian's originally fair face was now red from all the blood rushing to her head. Even her ears were all red. She hit his back with her fists in shame and frustration. "You! Set me down right now. You're being inappropriate. If my husband finds out, hell chop off your arms and legs." Chu Lian's tiny punches were like tickles to the slender, sturdy He Sanlang. He snorted, "You don't have any principles, do you? Weren't you just insulting your husband for being shameless and cold?" Chu Lian was left speechless by his words. She could only retort by struggling even more in his grasp. He Changdi had reached the limits of his patience. This wicked woman just liked to stir up trouble. He had thrown her onto his back in a moment of impulse. However, he was still feeling rather angry. So that was what she really thought of him, was it? Shameless? Cold? Heh. Fine. How could he compare to that warm and romantic Xiao Wujing after all? She probably didn't know that he was the very person that she just insulted. He Changdi was feeling extremely vexed thanks to Chu Lian's punches and kicks. The poison was still circulating in his body, so he wasn't feeling all too well, either. Chu Lian was his wife. He could do whatever he wanted to her without impunity. As his irritation with her increased, He Sanlang gripped her legs with one arm, freeing his other hand. A loud smack resounded as his palm landed on Chu Lian's soft, plush bottom. Chapter 297, Bandage, 1. This time, it wasn't just Chu Lian who was shocked silly. Even He Changdi's body stiffened a little, stunned by his own action born out of frustration. However, he quickly recovered his usual calm. She was his wife, so giving her a little smack was well within his rights. Although he had reasoned it out in his head, the back of his ears still turned red with embarrassment underneath his hair. The hand he had used to smack her bottom with dangled loosely at his sides. He Changdi made a grasping motion with his hand. It was almost like he could still feel the memory of that soft, plush feeling against his palm. He couldn't help but absent-mindedly wonder, why was that so soft? Chu Lian didn't agree. When she finally regained her senses, she was about to explode. Her previously stiff body seemed to be filled with strength now that her wits had returned. This time, she put all her energy into struggling as she shouted, "You shameless man! How could you do that?" When He Sanlang saw that she was struggling even more than before, he began to feel the inklings of a headache coming on. However, all he could do was continue threatening her with an icy expression. Was that one smack not enough? "I won't mind being even more shameless." Chu Lian froze. Like a deflating balloon, her body softened and she flopped obediently against He Changdi's back. She bit her lip and stopped struggling without saying another word. Since she was being carried on He Changdi's shoulder, he couldn't see her expression at all. The watery tears and redness in Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes went completely unnoticed. When he saw how effective his threat had been on her, He Sanlang relaxed and continued striding towards the cave with Chu Lian still slung over his shoulder. He felt terrible all over, and the high fever hadn't subsided fully, either. By the time he reached the cave and set Chu Lian down, his inner layer of clothing was completely soaked in cold sweat. As he panted and tried to catch his breath, His gaze landed on Chu Lian. She had hidden in a corner and was silently hugging her knees to herself. When he looked a little closer, a sudden realization struck him like a lightning bolt. Chu Lian had remained silent all the rest of the way back. He hadn't expected her to be crying. The corners of her eyes were red, along with the tip of her nose. Her almond-shaped eyes were all watery and it was clear she hadn't been able to hold back her tears. Chu Lian turned her head away, refusing to look at him. Her eyes were fixed on a pile of dried grass in the cave. Sanlang had calmed down more by now. He was starting to regret his rash actions from earlier. However, even though he wanted to explain things to Chu Lian and possibly reveal his identity, she refused to look at him. It was a little discouraging. Changdi stood awkwardly to one side with his tall figure. The look he directed towards Chu Lian was complex. He tried opening his mouth to speak, but nothing came out, not even the spittle of a clumsy explanation. Finally, he just tossed some words at her. "Don't go anywhere, the mountain forest isn't a safe place. Rest here for a while, I'll go and look for something to eat." With that, Sanlang turned and left the cave. It was only after the bearded man had finally disappeared that Chu Lian dared to look up towards the cave entrance. The beardie had just been too scary earlier. Now that it was just her alone in the cave, Chu Lian finally calmed down. She furiously rubbed at the tear tracks near the corners of her eyes. In her heart, she gave herself a warning. She couldn't get too close to this beardie, but she couldn't abandon him either. Her impulsive actions today had netted her a warning. Furthermore, this forest was full of hidden dangers. If she wanted to get out, she would still have to depend on that beardie. After an hour or so had passed, Chu Lian heard the sound of footsteps coming from the direction of the cave entrance. She peeked over and caught sight of that familiar tall figure. Chu Lian took a deep breath to remind herself to keep calm. Chapter 298, Bandage, 2. The beardie was carrying 2 pheasants, already stripped of their feathers, as he walked towards Chu Lian. With the light coming from his back, most of his face was shrouded in shadow and only his jet-black eyes shone with a profound glint. Chu Lian had only dared to risk a quick glance before looking down again. It seemed like the beardie had realized that his rash actions had made her more cautious towards him. When he walked towards the fire, he didn't say anything and simply pierced the 2 pheasants through with wooden sticks before placing them over the fire to roast. With Chu Lian's guard up, the moment the bearded man started walking towards her, she quickly tried shifting away. However, before she could get any further, her injured leg was caught in his grasp. Chu Lian abruptly looked up at the beardie, dumbfounded by his action. Her eyes shone with unhappiness, reluctant to let him do as he pleased. Sanlang simply cast a calm glance at her and asked with his magnetic voice, "What are you hiding for? Don't you want to keep this leg?" Upon hearing this, Chu Lian turned her gaze to the hand he was using to grip her ankle. The warmth of his palm scorched wherever it touched her skin. Even through the thick winter pants she had on, she could feel the intense heat of his body where he held her calf. Chu Lian shifted her gaze away awkwardly. She just didn't know how to react when he was acting so proper while bandaging her ankle. It was too different from that evil teasing of his before. Changdi lifted his own armor and pulled away the tunic beneath it to tear off a piece of his soft undershirt. Next, he attempted to lift up the hem of Chu Lian's skirt. However, after having experienced this once before, how could Chu Lian let him have his way? She quickly pulled down her skirt and said, "I know how to do it. I'll bandage it myself." Sanlang paused but didn't say anything. He stood up and moved over to one side, passing the strip of cloth to Chu Lian. Chu Lian took it and turned aside, presenting her back to him. Using the light of the fire, she carefully pulled down her white socks before rolling up the hem of the pants she was wearing underneath her skirt. Quite some time had passed since she had gotten injured. Blood from her wounds had already soaked through her socks and pants and then dried up, so her clothing was now stuck to her wounds. When she tried to peel it off, some of her flesh came off with it. It hurt a lot. With an additional beardie next to her, Chu Lian's heart was filled with resentment. She didn't want the beardie to look down on her, so she gritted her teeth and bore with the pain, pulling off the cloth stuck to her wounds all at once. Finally, her slender ankle and calf were exposed. After that bit of pain was over, Chu Lian sighed in relief. She was about to wipe at the fresh blood leaking from her wounds with the hem of her skirt when a large hand appeared in her vision. Held within those long, slender fingers was a damp white cloth. Chu Lian was a little stunned. In the next second, the low, magnetic tone of a man's voice said, "Wipe your wounds with this. This cloth is clean." Of course it was clean. He Sanlang had torn it off from the hem of his own undershirt. Chu Lian pressed her lips together. For some reason, she didn't quite dare to meet the beard's eyes. She reached out and took the damp cloth from his hands before carefully wiping at the wound on her ankle with her head bent down. Luckily, the wound wasn't too severe. It hadn't damaged any of her muscles or bones, but the flesh around her ankle was a mess right now. She probably wouldn't be able to walk normally for 10 to 20 days. As much as Chu Lian tried to hide her wounds, the cave was only so large, so Changdi had already caught sight of what it looked like. Chu Lian's skin was already fair in the first place. The exposed parts of her calf and ankle peeking out from under her clothes were equally fair and smooth, which made the raw and bloody wound look even more wretched. He Sanlang felt like he was suffocating. He turned away, unable to bear looking at that wound. After she finished cleaning, Chu Lian took some crushed herbs from the beard's hands to apply around the wound before carefully wrapping it up. Chapter 299, Roast Pheasant, 1. Changdi sat against the cave wall with a hand holding up his forehead. His eyes were shut and it looked like he was resting. After Chu Lian finished taking care of her wound, she settled down in a daze. The cave was silent. Neither of them made a sound. Finally, Chu Lian couldn't resist any longer and snuck a glance in his direction. The beardie didn't move. She glanced at him a few more times, but he still didn't show the slightest sign of movement. Chu Lian frowned and assumed that he was asleep. However, Changdi wasn't asleep at all. His head currently felt like it was splitting apart, and the high fever that had subsided earlier this morning had returned with a vengeance. After breaking out in cold sweat from lugging Chu Lian back to the cave, his bout of hunting, then cleaning off the pheasants with cold water at a brook, his body was on the verge of collapsing from all the physical labor. Furthermore, the poison hadn't been completely cleared from his system yet. The only reason he was still hanging on was because his body was more robust thanks to his daily training. If it had been any other normal man, they might have already long succumbed to the poison. With the warning she had received earlier, Chu Lian didn't dare to provoke him. She left him to his own devices, thinking he was asleep. Her gaze landed upon the 2 fat pheasants roasting on the fire. Chu Lian had worked herself to the bone today. Since she had given all of her beef jerky to the beardie the day before, she had been unable to eat anything after all that work. Thus, it had been almost an entire 24 hours since her last decent meal. As she stared at the 2 fat birds, she unconsciously began to drool. Chu Lian reached out and took one of the pheasants, carefully keeping an eye on the man next to her. When she saw that he hadn't reacted at all, she grew a little more daring. The pheasants had only been roasted on the outside. When Chu Lian sniffed at it, she realized that the side facing the fire was a little burnt since the pheasants hadn't been flipped at all. Chu Lian shot another glance at the bearded man before looking at the pheasant in her hands. Was the beardie really thinking of just placing the birds over the fire until they were done roasting? Chu Lian suspected that the 2 pheasants wouldn't even be edible by the time the beardie woke up. They would probably be completely charred, right? Even if they hadn't been turned to ashes, the outside would surely be burnt with the insides probably still raw. Chu Lian rolled her eyes and took out a purse and a small dagger from her waistband. Next, she brought out 2 small white porcelain bottles from her purse. As a true foodie, how could she not bring her own seasonings out with her on a trip to the wilderness? Of the 2 small bottles, one of them contained finely ground salt and the other contained Chu Lian's own special blend of 5-spice powder. The 5-spice powder was especially convenient when camping outdoors. She used the dagger to cut open the fattest part of the pheasant before rubbing the salt and 5-spice powder inside the meat. Then, Chu Lian found a flat, thin piece of rock lying around the cave. After cleaning it, she placed the rock over the fire to warm until it grew hot enough to put the pheasant on. Placing the meat on the rock would distribute the heat more evenly so it wouldn't burn as fast. It was also more convenient to flip the meat. Chu Lian looked at the remaining bird. When she thought back to how the beardy had taken advantage of her, she curled her lip and decided not to bother with it. Since he wanted to roast it that way, he could eat it however he liked. He Sanlang's head was extremely heavy and fuzzy. He was feeling terrible, so he wasn't sleeping at all. He was just resting his eyes since he didn't have the energy to move. When he noticed Chu Lian taking one of the pheasants in the middle of his haze, he started to become a little more alert. Then, when he saw her take out a small purse and start to season the pheasant, he wanted to burst out into laughter. When had this wicked woman turned into a foodie? She had actually brought seasonings out with her, and she even had a little knife to cut up the meat. As High Vision turned blurry and his mind felt even more dizzy, only Chu Lian's busy figure was left reflected in his eyes. How strange. They were clearly the same person, but why did he feel that the Chu Lian before him and the Chu Lian from his past life were starting to separate in his mind? Chu Lian's stomach had already grumbled a few times. She stared at the pheasant on the fire, drool almost spilling from her mouth. An enticing aroma slowly came off the salted and seasoned pheasant. The fats in the pheasant's skin were helping to make the surface brown and crispy. The outer layer of meat was glistening with a thin layer of oil. Chu Lian could almost imagine the tenderness of the meat in her mouth. All it would take was one bite. Chu Lian carefully took the roast pheasant down from the flat rock and let it cool down on another rock she had cleaned earlier. She was about to tear off a fat, tender drumstick when a hand shot out from the side. Chu Lian watched with widened eyes as the newly awakened beardy tore off a drumstick without asking and immediately began to bite into it. By the time Chu Lian managed to react, she could only cry out angrily, "What did you eat my pheasant for? Yours is still on the fire." He Sanlang had bitten into the meatiest part of the drumstick with his first bite. The skin of the pheasant was crispy, and its meat tender. The juices within oozed out and filled his mouth with their fragrance. That new and delicious taste was instantly etched into his memory. He was just about as hungry as Chu Lian was, so he managed to polish off the entire drumstick in just 3 bites. In this lifetime, the wicked woman had really become a great foodie. Possibly the only trait she had that was worthy of praise was her godly cooking skills. Since she was taking up the position of his legitimate wife, there was no reason for him not to enjoy the fruits of her labor, right? As he watched Chu Lian puff up her cheeks with a helpless expression on her face, he Sanlang felt a trace of satisfaction soothing his battered body. TL note: the return of food porn. Slices of roast pheasant roasted over fire, Western-style roast pheasant. Chapter 300, Roast Pheasant, 2. He Sanlang swallowed his last mouthful of meat and tossed the bones to one side. Then, he looked up at Chu Lian and narrowed his eyes. "I hunted this wild pheasant." Chu Lian couldn't come up with anything to say to that. She tried her utmost to calm her anger. He was right, he had been the one to catch it. She had only added a little bit of work to cook it. If he wanted to snatch it from her, she had no right to stop him at all. In the end, Chu Lian could only give him a fierce glare. From that whole pheasant, Chu Lian only managed to get 1 drumstick and a few pieces of tender meat. The rest of it went down he Sanlang's gullet. Chu Lian rubbed her bloated tummy while complaining under her breath that he Sanlang had eaten too much and that she hadn't gotten her fill. Meanwhile, he Sanlang leaned against the cave wall, too lazy to even look at the two-faced woman. Chu Lian hadn't realized it yet, nor had he Changdi himself. When the two of them had shared the roast pheasant, apart from the first drumstick that he Sanlang had eaten, he had given the best parts of the pheasant to Chu Lian. It was only after Chu Lian had eaten enough that he had gobbled up the rest of it. Chu Lian was helpless against a forceful, food-stealing tyrant like he Sanlang. When the two of them finished eating, Chu Lian turned to look at the other pheasant that had been moved off the fire. She inwardly lamented. They couldn't waste food like that. In the end, she took the remaining half-cooked pheasant and seasoned it before wrapping it up in clean dry leaves, setting it off to one side. It would be their breakfast tomorrow. When Chu Lian looked out towards the cave entrance, she noticed that the sky was slowly turning dark. She then shot a careful glance at the beardy. Who knew if he had any assurance that he would be able to bring her out of this desolate forest? Chu Lian secretly made a decision. If the beardie didn't mention leaving at all tomorrow, she would have to start a frank discussion with him. Night fell once again. This time, Chu Lian was very careful. She set down her cloak across the fire from the bearded man and slowly laid down. She even turned her back to him. He Sanlang inwardly snorted and wasn't bothered at all by Chu Lian's caution. He simply laid down on the floor and placed his arms behind his head. He wasn't feeling well in the first place, so he quickly fell asleep. However, Chu Lian tossed and turned and was unable to join him in slumber. Even by the fire, the cold in a cave in winter was enough to make her curl up like a shrimp. When she thought back to the warm slumber she had yesterday, Chu Lian felt rather pathetic. Her body shrunk into itself and she hugged her knees, almost transforming into a round, human ball. Chu Lian forced herself to shut her eyes and get some rest. Luckily, she was successful with coercing herself to sleep. Thanks to the fatigue she had racked up during the day, she quickly fell into a sweet dream. Chu Lian woke up blearily to the sound of someone talking after sleeping for an unknown period of time. The fire next to her had already been extinguished. She had woken up from the cold. She wrapped her cloak tightly around herself and used the weak moonlight streaming in from outside the cave to feel her way around and add some dried branches to the fire. When the cave was illuminated once again, Chu Lian realized that the sounds she had heard in her dream had been made by the beardie across the fire. She stayed where she was and carefully stared at the beardie for a while. When he didn't seem to react, she used the cave wall as support to limp over to his side. When Chu Lian finally reached the bearded man, she realized that the half of his face illuminated by the fire's light was completely red. A few loose strands of his hair were stuck to his face thanks to the layer of sweat on his skin. Chu Lian suffered a shock and quickly reached out to touch his forehead. She had only touched it for a mere second before taking her hand back. It was just too hot. Now Chu Lian was starting to panic. Although the beardie was very annoying, she couldn't let anything happen to him now. If he didn't survive, she would never be able to leave this forest, ever. Chu Lian gritted her teeth and squatted by the fire. She fashioned a crude torch for herself and hobbled out of the cave. If she remembered correctly, there was a small brook about 50 meters away from the cave. By hopping on one leg, Chu Lian took half an hour to cover the total distance of 100 meters or more. She covered the beardie's boiling hot forehead with a damp cloth before taking off the armor and tunic he had on, revealing his muscled chest. They were currently in a state of emergency, so Chu Lian had no mood to admire the body exposed to her eyes. She quickly used the damp cloth to wipe down his chest and hands to lower his temperature. However, He Sanlang's skin was really nice. Even though he was training outdoors every day in the northern border, getting whipped by the wind and tanned by the sun, he hadn't gotten that much darker. There wasn't much difference in the color of his skin compared to when he had been in the capital. If he hadn't specially kept a beard and gone out with his full set of armor, no one would believe that he was the son of a military official, let alone an officer in the army. While his chest was buff and muscled, it wasn't bronzed like those of many other men in the army. His skin was still rather fair, but not the sickly pale skin of someone who rarely saw the sun. It was a healthy and natural light color. As expected of someone with the nickname of He Sanlang the Fair, Chu Lian wiped the bearded man down 3 or 4 times in this manner. When she checked his forehead again, his fever seemed to have subsided a little. Chu Lian sighed in relief. As long as his fever continued subsiding, the beardie would probably survive the night. It was at this time that the man started to talk in his sleep. "You wicked woman. I'll never forgive you. You, dream on." Chapter 301, The Virgin He Sanlang, 1. Chu Lian was shocked by the sudden shout. She yanked back her hand and stared at the man with wide eyes, but his own eyes still stayed shut. When she realized that he had only been sleep-talking, she patted her chest in relief and calmed down. That had really scared her. The beard's mouth moved again as he mumbled something. However, he spoke too softly and quickly. Chu Lian couldn't catch what he was saying at all. Chu Lian crept over again, too curious to deny herself. She leaned her ear closer to see if she could catch anything. She wanted to know what he was saying. Even though she was as close to him as she could get, Chu Lian could only make out a few words. After a moment, Chu Lian straightened up. Her brows furrowed as she thought about his odd ramblings. "Ha! You wicked woman. Are you regretting your betrayal now? He turned out to be a bad guy in the end. He even betrayed you. Are you sad? Are you hurt? Let me tell you, the pain I feel is 100 times more than yours, Chu Lian." The corner of her mouth twitched as she looked at the man before her. Had this guy suffered some sort of heartbreak previously? Just as Chu Lian was thinking about listening to more of his juicy ramblings, the man quieted down and stopped talking. Shortly after, his temperature began to rise again. Chu Lian had no choice but to continue wiping him down with a cloth to help him lower his temperature. Finally, Chu Lian leaned against the cave wall and let the beardie use her lap as a pillow. This way, if his condition changed, she could wake up from her sleep and check if he was still burning up. Near the end of the night, Chu Lian was just too tired. She fell asleep leaning against the wall. In her dreams, she felt something tighten around her waist. However, she was just way too tired to react. She didn't even have the energy to open her eyes to see what it was. Trapped in his nightmares, Sanlang's brows were tightly knitted together. Right as he was being tortured both mentally and physically, in his most troubled time, it felt like his body had suddenly been immersed in some place warm and comfortable. He caught a hint of a familiar, comforting scent and quickly calmed down. His entire head seemed to be ensconced in that sweet smell, helping to quiet his chaotic thoughts. The high fever slowly subsided along with them. At some point, Sanlang's arms had reached out to wrap around Chu Lian's slender waist. That soft and cozy feeling comforted him in the midst of his deep slumber. Sanlang took in deep breaths, subconsciously wanting to keep this sweet smell and feeling to himself. The hold of his arms tightened along with his thoughts. It wasn't until Chu Lian wriggled a little due to the uncomfortable embrace that the comatose Sanlang finally awoke. He opened his eyes slowly. When he noticed what he was hugging in his arms, his entire body stiffened instantly. The remnants of his terrible dreams replayed in his mind. When he looked up only to see the same face of the woman that haunted his nightmares, Changdi felt extremely disgusted, as if he had just swallowed a big fat fly. He quickly let go of Chu Lian's waist and sat up. He even shifted back a few steps to put some distance between them. Luckily, that wicked woman was sleeping like the dead. His sudden movements hadn't caused her to wake up at all. Changdi rubbed his temples. His head was hurting beyond belief. The moment he had woken up and seen Chu Lian, he had thought that his past and present lives had overlapped. However, as his mind slowly returned to consciousness, the Chu Lian in his mind slowly started to split apart and turned into two polar opposites. Changdi turned to Chu Lian with an unreadable expression. She was still in the same pose as earlier, leaning stiffly against the uneven cave wall with her legs straight. One of her limp hands was holding onto a damp cloth. The small gourd filled with water had been flipped over, leaving a small puddle of water on the ground that was slowly icing over. With his intellect, it wasn't hard for Changdi to guess at what Chu Lian had done for him. However, it also threw his heart into even more chaos. He kept his eyes fixed on the sleeping woman just a few steps away from him. In his mind, two different figures were flashing one after another. Which one was the real Chu Lian? Should he trust her again? Just as Sanlang was absorbed in his painful thoughts, his sharp ears caught the soft sound of footsteps from outside the cave. He tensed and immediately leaped up, moving over to Chu Lian's side and shaking her awake. Chu Lian was shaken awake. While she was still in a sleepy daze, she heard the beardie say with a grave expression, "Sure. Someone's coming." The remaining sleepiness in her mind was instantly pushed away by her fear. Sanlang tossed aside his complicated thoughts and subconsciously placed himself in front of Chu Lian, shielding her behind him. He took out a dagger from his waistband. His deep eyes were focused on the cave's entrance like an eagle on the hunt. They didn't have time to hide now. Someone had clearly discovered their presence in the cave. Changdi's sharp brows were locked together. He only hoped that the intruders weren't two hoons. He didn't have any weapons at hand and his body wasn't at peak condition. Furthermore, he had a weak woman by his side to protect. He wouldn't be a match for the elite warriors of the two hoon right now. Chu Lian's gaze was also fixed on the entrance of the cave, her eyes filled with extreme caution. She felt in one of the purses hung at her waist and took out a bottle of chili powder. If it really came down to a fight, she was going to fling this powder right in her opponent's face. Chapter 302, The Virgin He Sanlang, 2. It didn't take too long for their visitors to arrive. Two strange figures appeared at the cave entrance. Now that He Sanlang could make out the faces of the newcomers, his tightly wound nerves relaxed completely. "Brother He! Captain!" Two shouts full of surprised joy jolted Chu Lian awake. He Sanlang set down the dagger in his hands and went over to welcome them. The people who had come were Lieutenant Xiao Yuhong and another good soldier under He Changdi's command, Zhao Liang. It seemed like the signal he had sent out earlier had worked. Xiao Yuhong, who was younger than He Changdi by just a year, hugged him tightly in happiness. He then pounded He Changdi on the back forcefully. "Brother He, you scared us to death. Are you okay?" When Zhao Liang and I found the signal and came looking, we bumped into a Tuhun scout. "We've already settled him." Zhao Liang, standing off to one side, nodded in agreement. He Sanlang patted both of them on the shoulders. "Good work, you two." While standing behind He Sanlang, Chu Lian was completely dazed. She stared at Xiao Yuhong first, then Zhao Liang, with her big, innocent eyes. For some reason, the way they addressed the beardie seemed a little strange to her. "Brother He?" This beardie's surname was He and he was also a captain. Surely it wasn't just a coincidence. Chu Lian finally set her gaze on her savior's tall and muscled back. His bearded face came up in her mind. She shook her head. No matter how she tried, she just couldn't reconcile He Changdi's handsome good looks to the gruff, bearded face of her savior. Chu Lian huffed in relief and reassured herself that it was only a coincidence. There were tens of thousands of men in the northern border troops. It wouldn't be weird for there to be another Captain He, right? However, despite thinking that, there was a sense of unease in her heart. As Xiao Yuhong was chatting with He Sanlang, he happened to take a glance behind him. A look of startled envy flitted across his eyes and he gaped like an idiot. Xiao Yuhong immediately blurted out, "Brother He, is this sister-in-law?" He Sanlang hadn't expected Xiao Yuhong to blurt out a question like that. He didn't reply to Xiao Yuhong immediately and simply turned back to cast a calm look at Chu Lian. He wanted to know what kind of expression that wicked woman was going to make. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes widened into huge circles. Her body froze up completely as she looked at the grinning Xiao Yuhong before turning back to the beardie. "Heh! What kind of joke was that?" Chu Lian did her best to recover from her extreme stupefaction. When she didn't hear any response from the beardie after a few seconds, the heart that had just about beat out of her chest settled down again. It must be a misunderstanding after all. Perhaps this beardie had also come to pick up his wife and happened to rescue Chu Lian along the way in a bout of coincidence. That might be why she had been mistaken for his wife. That's right, that must be it. Even though Chu Lian knew just how poor that reasoning was in the depths of her heart, she would rather believe that the beardie she had spent 2 days and nights with wasn't He Changdi. Thinking back to all the silly things she had done, she just wanted to dig a hole in the ground and burrow into it. Not recognizing her own husband. Scolding him as if he were some other man. And even getting a little intimate with him while under the assumption that he was some other man. Chu Lian couldn't bear to continue thinking along those lines. She just hoped that the heavens would bless her with a bit of luck and help her out, just this once. He Changdi moved his gaze away from Chu Lian, a corner of his lips raising as he mocked her in his heart. Even the dense Xiao Yuhong had realized that something wasn't right between the couple. His smile faded away and he quickly bumped He Sanlang with his shoulder. In a low voice, he asked, "Brother He, what happened? Did you make sister-in-law unhappy?" He Sanlang glared at him coldly, warning him to keep his mouth shut. Xiao Yuhong was naturally a person who didn't like silence. His eyes darted around the cave before he moved closer to He Sanlang and continued his questioning at an even lower volume. "Brother He, since you spent 2 nights outside with sister-in-law, could it be that sister-in-law is angry because you didn't give her enough goods? If that's the case, you have to explain things properly to her. We don't even have any women in camp to comfort us since the laws in our camp are more strict." When Xiao Yuhong finished speaking in a boorish tone, he sent a meaningful look in the direction of He Sanlang's third leg. The people in the camp were all men. When they gathered together to chat at night, it was hard to avoid the topic of women. In the course of time, even the virgin Xiao Yuhong had been infected by their coarse talk. Furthermore, He Changdi and Chu Lian hadn't even been married for half a year. He Changdi had also left the capital soon after marriage. Since the young couple's relationship was still new at the time of his departure, they obviously hadn't had enough quality time together. It was normal to assume they had done the horizontal dance while trapped together for the past couple days. He Changdi hadn't expected that his younger army comrade would make a joke like this right in front of him. His handsome, bearded face froze up, turning darker and darker. To Xiao Yuhong, He Changdi roared, "What nonsense are you saying?" Luckily, He Sanlang's hair hid his flushed ears. Otherwise, if the mischievous Xiao Yuhong caught sight of them, he would definitely get smug and tease him for being shy. Actually, even though He Sanlang looked calm and wise on the outside, what with his normally cool expression, he was still a virgin in both this life and the past one. If Xiao Yuhong ever found out about this fact, he would probably point at He Sanlang and laugh for 3 days straight. He had such a beautiful wife by his side, yet he hadn't touched her at all. Could he even be considered a man? His tall and vigorous brother, he couldn't possibly be impotent, right? Chapter 303, The Beardy is He Sanlang. 1. Just as the two men were bickering, the sound of footsteps came from the cave entrance. When Xiao Yuhong noticed that He Changdi's eyes were turning grave, he quickly hit his own head as if he had just remembered something. "That's right, brother He, I forgot to tell you. Your family's private soldiers came with us. That should be them arriving now." Right after he finished speaking, a group of men entered the cave. In the lead was Mo Chenggui. Once Mo Chenggui caught sight of He Sanlang, he ran up to his young master excitedly. He stood in front of the other private soldiers and bowed to He Changdi. "Third young master, this old servant is relieved that you're well." Perhaps due to the difference in their status, there was no trace of the haughtiness and disdain that Mo Chenggui had shown in front of Chu Lian when he stood before He Changdi. These old soldiers who had followed old Count Jingen into battle were truly loyal and concerned for the male masters of the He family. Standing behind the rest, just a few meters away, Chu Lian was immersed in shock. Her almond-shaped eyes were wide open while her slightly pink lips were parted. A single sentence resonated in her mind: "The Beardy is He Sanlang." How could that be? Her eyes unconsciously fixed on He Changdi. Her heart pounded quickly in her chest. She didn't know whether it was due to the flurry of emotions that had risen, or due to the tension and nervousness within her heart. The moment she remembered all the stupid things she had done in front of He Sanlang while taking him for a stranger, she really wanted to just bury herself. As her thoughts ran wildly in her mind, she couldn't hold back a glare at He Sanlang. That fellow had known all along and had actually teased her on purpose, just to watch her make a joke of herself. How utterly shameless. Chu Lian's face flushed red as her chest heaved with every breath. However, she couldn't reveal the truth in front of these people, so she could only bear with the frustration. He Changdi nodded and replied calmly, "I'm fine, but the war in Liangju continues. We have to return quickly." Xiao Yuhong had also turned serious. He smiled and nodded at Chu Lian before leading the men out of the cave and ordering someone to bring He Changdi a horse. It was only then that He Sanlang turned to look at Chu Lian and noticed her frustrated expression. Chu Lian knew that she was the one at fault for being face-blind and not recognizing him, so she felt too embarrassed to be the one to speak first. When she met with his cold gaze, she shifted her eyes away guiltily. He Sanlang stood ramrod straight with his hands behind his back and continued staring at her until Chu Lian could feel goosebumps rising on her skin. Finally, he walked over to her slowly. "How impressive, my wife. You didn't even manage to recognize your own husband. Then you should open your eyes a little more and take a good look. Otherwise, you might even take a stranger for your husband next time and put a green hat on my head." After he finished saying all of this in an icy tone, he didn't wait for Chu Lian's fiery gaze to turn to him before sweeping her up into a princess carry and bringing her out of the cave. Chu Lian was extremely angry, but she couldn't quarrel with her husband in front of so many people. It would be bad for both of their reputations. Thus, the most she could do was to glare at He Sanlang while in his embrace. Of course, He Changdi could feel the grudge and killer intent in Chu Lian's eyes. He looked down coldly at Chu Lian. If you like to look at me so much, I'll let you have your fill when we get back to Liangju. Chu Lian gritted her teeth and complained to herself inwardly. Who's trying to look at him? It's only that crazy He Sanlang who can say something like that without any expression on his face. When Xiao Yuhong saw that He Changdi was carrying Chu Lian out of the cave, a mischievous look lit up in his eyes. Brother He, take good care of sister-in-law. He pointed at a handsome horse nearby which was all black except for its white tail and hooves and explained, Brother He, we found your horse for you, but it has quite a few wounds on its body. The wounds were probably made by those damned two hoons. You can't ride on this horse for now, so you and sister-in-law can take my horse instead. I'll ride with Zhao Liang. He Sanlang looked at his beloved steed and nodded. Chu Lian turned her gaze curiously towards that handsome black horse. The horse seemed to be rather intelligent. When it noticed its owner, He Changdi, looking at it even wickered at He Sanlang and blinked its big eyes coquettishly. When Chu Lian's eyes followed the curve of the horse's smooth back, she noticed that there were some wounds on the horse's rump and back which had already started to scab over. A small suspicion surfaced in her mind. If she didn't guess wrongly, these wounds weren't made by the two hoons instead, they were likely made by He Changdi himself to drive his steed on when chasing after her mad horse. Thus, Chu Lian sent an apologetic look to the horse. He Sanlang personally helped Chu Lian onto Xiao Yuhong's horse, before leaping up and sitting behind her. When Zhao Liang saw that the captain was only wearing his armor and that the cloak on the captain's wife was dirted, he took off his own cloak and passed it to He Sanlang. He Sanlang gave pause before receiving the cloak. He looked down at the fragile woman before him. He hesitated for a moment, but finally, he wrapped the dark-colored cloak around Chu Lian and made sure she was completely covered. When Chu Lian felt the warmth coming back to her body and noticed the thick cloak on her body, she was about to speak up to thank him. However, He Sanlang spoke first at a low volume, You don't have to thank me. I just don't want you to catch a cold and become a burden for me. That one sentence made the gratitude in Chu Lian's heart vanish into thin air. Chu Lian decided to shut her mouth and stop bothering with that crazy husband of hers. Chapter 304, The Beardy is He Sanlang, 2. Everyone quickly mounted their horses. It was getting late. If they didn't move quickly, it would be dark by the time they left the forest. There were too many unknowns in the dark, and there had already been one ambush. They couldn't give the two hoons another chance to attack them. Furthermore, He Changdi held a post in the army. This time, he had come out against the wishes of Captain Guo. It had already been 2 days, so they couldn't delay their return any longer. Even so, when He Sanlang returned to the camp, he would likely have to suffer some punishment. The men rode their horses hard and none of them had the mood to talk at this time. Chu Lian gripped the saddle of the galloping horse under her tightly as the cold winter winds brushed against her cheeks like knives. Her shaking body had been stabilized at some point by a strong arm wrapped around her waist. As furious as she was with her husband, it would be silly of her to struggle at this time and place. Thanks to that strong arm holding her steady, Chu Lian's back was pressed against He Sanlang's chest. Even through that cold and hard armor, she could still hear the fast, powerful beat of his heart. She pressed her lips together as a warm flush overtook her face. She covered her face with her hands and told herself that the only reason her face was so hot was because of the chafing cold winds. When dusk fell, the party finally reached a small town close to Liangju City. The maidservants and retainers who had accompanied Chu Lian here, along with the 2 guards that Princess Wei had sent, were resting in a residence here and recovering from their injuries. Zhao Liang dismounted first and went off to report their arrival. The entrance of their courtyard was immediately flung open from the inside as Wenqing and Wenlan came out to welcome her. He Changdi carried Chu Lian off the horse, but didn't let her down. He carried her straight into the courtyard under the watch of Wenqing and Wenlan. The 2 maidservants followed after with pale and panicked faces. Manager Qin's face was also full of worry. He looked towards the men who had escorted He Changdi and Chu Lian back. Since he had clearly seen how Mo Chenggui had treated his 3rd young madam, His gaze skipped over the old soldier and landed on Zhao Liang and Xiao Hongyu instead. He quickly walked over to ask, "Excuse me, sirs. What happened to our third young madam? Has she been injured anywhere?" Xiao Hongyu saw that he was truly worried, so he reported what he had been told. "I heard brother he say that she injured her foot. Don't worry, sister-in-law's injury isn't too bad. She should be fine after a few days of rest." When he heard Xiao Hongyu's reply, Manager Qin heaved a sigh of relief. He thought carefully about their current situation. Half of third young madam's party was injured, so they probably wouldn't be able to continue their journey immediately. They would likely have to stay in this small town for a few days. "Sirs, please come in and rest. I've already ordered the servants to cook a meal for our guests." Xiao Hongyu and Zhao Liang were indeed hungry. However, when they thought of the military order hanging over their heads, they waved their hands in rejection. "Kind sir, there's no need for that. Once brother he comes out, we have to hurry back to camp." Manager Qin almost gaped in shock. You're still rushing back to camp?" He looked up at the darkening sky. "But it's almost night. It was already dangerous enough to rush on the roads in winter. This area was close to the northern border, so the risk was even higher." Zhao Liang smiled bitterly. "Thanks for your kind offer, sir, but we have to follow our orders." Seeing how resolute they were, Manager Qin couldn't hold them back. However, he couldn't let their guests continue standing outside either. These men were clearly third young master's comrades and subordinates. He had to treat them well. Thus, he invited the men into the courtyard to sit for a while and ordered the servants to bring in hot water. He also prepared some food and wrapped it up for the soldiers to bring along. Manager Qin was very smooth and capable. He did all of the above under Chu Lian's name, so that He Sanlang's comrades would have a good impression of their brave sister-in-law who had come all the way to the northern border. In the main room of the small courtyard, He Sanlang set Chu Lian down on the bed and turned to leave with a cold expression. Wenqing and Wenlan came over anxiously to ask about Chu Lian's condition. Chu Lian didn't have the mood to answer the two girls. Instead, she turned towards He Changdi's departing back and quickly called, "Where are you going?" He Changdi hadn't expected Chu Lian to call out for him. He froze and stopped walking. Wenqing and Wenlan could see that their masters had something to say to each other. Wenqing shot a look at Wenlan and the two girls quietly stood up, bobbed towards Chu Lian, and retreated. They even closed the room's door for the couple. He Changdi shifted sideways so he could look back and see Chu Lian's small figure sitting on the bed. He suddenly felt that his throat was as dry as a desert. He couldn't say anything at all and could only cough and use the sound to cover up his guilt and awkwardness. Chu Lian clenched the hem of her clothes in her hands and seemed to be having trouble speaking as well. However, it hadn't been easy for them to meet again, and they were married after all. If they left this misunderstanding as it was, it wouldn't be good for them. She could also feel that He Sanlang's attitude towards her had improved significantly since their wedding day. With that thought, she gathered up her courage and blurted out in one go, "He Sanlang, I'm in the wrong for not recognizing you. I'm apologizing to you first." He Changdi's eyes that had always been unreadable since his reincarnation began to ripple with emotion. Those beautiful ripples expanded and grew until they reached his heart. TL note announcing a change of names. Xiao Yuhong-Xiao Hongyu. All previous chapters have been updated and this character will be referred to with Xiao Hongyu from now. The author pulled a switch on me and swapped the two Chinese characters of this guy's name at chapter 301 and I didn't realize until 3 chapters later. It's dash for those who are curious. Chapter 305, Military Law, 1. When Chu Lian saw He Sanlang just stand there, she became a little discouraged and down. She began to sulk, and in a low voice, she said, "You can't blame me for that. You're like a totally different person once you grow a beard. Grandmother probably wouldn't even be able to recognize you, let alone me." He Sanlang was skilled in martial arts and had excellent physical abilities to boot. His 5 senses were also stronger than most people, and that included hearing. Even the tiniest mumble from Chu Lian would reach his ears. He Sanlang chuckled lowly. Chu Lian couldn't tell if his laughter was out of joy or mocking her. She heard him say, "By saying so, You think you're justified even though you didn't recognize your own husband? Chu Lian couldn't help but ridicule him in her head. This crazy bastard had such a sharp tongue. She had already set down her pride to apologize to him first. She could ignore how he hadn't forgiven her, but now he was actually mocking her instead. The pool of calm that she had managed to recover was almost completely drained by that bastard Changdi. Chu Lian sucked in a deep breath and let the cold air help her calm down again. Sanlang, must you always pick a fight with me? After he suffered a jolt from her words, Changdi pressed his lips together and sunk into silence. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. What was going on? The Changdi in the novel had clearly been a handsome, caring nice guy. How had he turned into such a frustrating tsundere? He was just like a cold piece of rock. Were the heavens trying to make a fool of her? Chu Lian didn't want to stay on this topic any longer. Yet when she remembered how he looked back in the cave, poisoned and running a high fever throughout the night, Chu Lian couldn't set down her worry for him. Her leg was still injured, so she couldn't stand. She could only tilt her head back and strain her neck as she asked him, "Has the poison been completely cleared out of your system? When I checked your body, I found a wound on the side of your neck. That poison probably came from the arrows of the two hoon." Sanlang's lips moved slightly, but he paused before replying, "It's fine now. It's just a common poison, it won't leave behind any side effects." Hearing him explain so, the burden of worry in Chu Lian's heart was finally set loose. No matter what, Changdi had gotten poisoned while saving her. If anything happened to him, she would feel guilty for the rest of her life. It's already so late. Why don't you invite your brothers-in-arms to stay back and eat dinner with us? Changdi cast a glance at the woman who was finally acting a little more like a matriarch of the He family. His heart warmed, but the cold expression on his face didn't budge a single bit. No need. My brothers and I will set off for the camp immediately. Ah! You're going back right now? It's already dark outside. In her surprise, Chu Lian blurted out her thoughts directly. This action stunned both of them for a moment. Changdi recovered first. In a slightly softer voice, he said, "You want to keep me back?" Chu Lian looked downwards, her neck flushed. She quickly said, "Since you're so anxious to go, it must be due to military orders. You should leave earlier then. I'll get Wenlan to pack some food for you to bring on the way back." When Changdi heard her reply, he felt a sliver of disappointment. "Take good care of yourself, then. I can't always be around to save you just in time." On that parting note, Changdi turned and left without looking back. Chu Lian raised her fist and shook it at Sanlang's departing figure. That guy just had to make her mad, even when he was leaving, as expected of a lunatic. Ooh, she was so mad. When Wenqing and Wenlan saw that Changdi had left, they quickly ran back in. Chu Lian let them look at the wound on her ankle. She thought for a moment before giving them some orders. "Wenqing, go and prepare 2 sets of inner clothes for third young master. Add some jerky and wine as well. And that pair of thick deerskin leather boots. Ah, right, don't forget to pack those detoxifying creams and medicinal ointments too." Changdi had torn his inner clothes to bandage her wound. Who knew if he still had enough to wear back at camp? Wenqing and Wenlan noted down all of Chu Lian's instructions and nodded. As they left the room, they exchanged sly, happy smiles. It seemed like their third young madam was getting along well with their third young master. Just look at how worried she was. She was practically shoving everything she brought to third young master. Changdi entered the sitting room and exchanged some words with manager Qin before leading Xiao Hongyu and the others away, preparing to set off on an overnight journey back to camp. He didn't expect Mo Chenggui to lead the family's private soldiers out and mount their steeds along with them, clearly intent on following Sanlang back. Changdi frowned and gripped his reins. He turned to Mo Chenggui and said, "Uncle Mo, stay here with your men and take care of third young madam. You're not to follow me back to camp this time." Although Sanlang's tone was calm, there was a hidden trace of unhappiness within. How could Mo Chenggui not detect that? "Third young master, that won't do. This old man has been ordered by the matriarch to help third young master." Changdi looked him right in the eye. Although his young master had just come of age, Mo Chenggui could feel a domineering aura from within their cold depths. He found he was unable to meet his master's gaze directly. It was as if the old count himself was standing right before him. Uncle Mo, helping me take care of Chu Lian is the best way you can help me right now. Although Mo Chenggui wasn't very willing, since third young master had already given his orders, he couldn't keep rejecting them. Yes, third young master. This old servant will obey your command. Mo Chenggui waved his hand, ordering the family soldiers to dismount. He Changdi picked up the package that Chu Lian had prepared for him and led his men on the long journey back to camp. Chapter 306, Military Law, 2. It was only when He Changdi's figure had disappeared into the dark alleyways of the small town that Mo Chenggui brought his men back, a gloomy expression on his face. By his side was his old comrade, Huang Zhijian. Huang had become one of the He family's private soldiers after retiring together with him. The two of them were as close as real brothers. Huang Zhijian patted his old brother's shoulder. Old Mo, don't take it to heart. We shouldn't have been so rash as to leave third young madam behind like that. If we hadn't tried to rush ahead of her, this wouldn't have happened. A bellyful of anger had long been brewing within Mo Chenggui. He had managed to suppress it this whole time, but after the past few days, it was about to spill out from his eyes. He had thought he would be able to dampen it eventually, but after the aggravation of today's events, he could no longer hold it back. I just can't understand why the matriarch sent a spoiled young girl like third young madam out to the northern border. Isn't she just making trouble for third young master? Look at her tiny size, what can she do? See, we haven't even reached Liangju and she's already caused trouble for third young master. Military orders must be obeyed. Once third young master returns to camp, he'll be punished by military law. And that military law, old Mo, that's enough, stop right there. Before Mo Chenggui could vent enough, Huang Zhijian shoved his arm. What? I can't even rant now? Old Mo. Third young madam's right behind us. Huang Zhijian had no other choice but to lower his voice and try to remind him of their location. Mo Chenggui paused and turned around to look. As old Huang had said, Chu Lian was currently standing under the eaves of the courtyard with the support of Wenlan, frowning while staring at them. Her expression didn't look too good. Mo Chenggui was still angry, so his tone wasn't very nice as he said to her, "It's already dark. Third young madam should go and rest while it's early, otherwise the two hoons might capture third young madam again." Huang Zhijian quickly tugged his old comrade and turned to Chu Lian apologetically. "Third young madam, please don't blame old Mo. This is just how he is." The two of them were both leaders of House Jingan's soldiers and old retainers of House Jingan, so they held a high position within the estate. However, Chu Lian was still one of their masters, so they didn't have the right to speak to her in such a tone. From the way He Sanlang had rushed to save Chu Lian running headfirst into danger without concern for his own life, Huang Zhijian could tell that the young couple's relationship was not as bad as what the rumors outside would have them believe. Third young madam was doted on by matriarch He within the estate. Right now, the estate was still lacking the next male heir. If third young madam got pregnant someday and gave birth to the first male of the next generation, her standing within the estate might even match that of heir Jingan's wife. If old Mo offended third young madam greatly at this time, the ones to suffer in the future would be old Mo and his family. Furthermore, third young madam wasn't as weak as she looked. That Guilin restaurant she opened had become the top restaurant in the capital almost overnight. If she was really that weak, how could her restaurant have become so popular? It was just the stubborn old Mo who refused to see things clearly. Chu Lian didn't care about what Mo Chenggui had said at all. Her focus had been completely drawn by what Mo Chenggui had said before that. She couldn't help but ask, "What did you say just now?" "My husband will be punished by military law?" Mo Chenggui's rage seemed to have been stoked by Chu Lian's sudden question. Third young master left his camp without permission. Of course he's going to be punished. Chu Lian didn't really know much about the army, especially in the ancient Great Wu dynasty. She was completely stunned by Mo Chenggui's reply. What kind of punishment will he receive? Mo Chenggui was practically huffing fire by now, so Huang Zhijian didn't dare to let him speak. He quickly replied first, third young master has disobeyed orders, so the minimum punishment he'll get will be 20 smacks with the rod. Third young madam, you don't have to worry too much. Third young master has a strong body and is all muscle. Those 20 smacks are nothing to him. After Huang Zhijian finished speaking, he shot a sideways glance at Chu Lian. When he saw that she was still in a daze, he quickly pulled Mo Chenggui away and bade his farewells. If there's nothing you need us for, third young madam, old Mo and I will withdraw for now. Please don't worry about the safety of this courtyard, we've already set up watch over the area for the night. It was long after Mo Chenggui and Huang Zhijian had left that Chu Lian abruptly came back to her senses. She looked at Wenlan and sighed. Let's return. Wenlan was both happy yet sorry. Third young madam, third young master treats you so well. In the future, if anyone dares to say that third young master doesn't treat you well, this servant will tell them this story to make them shut up. Chu Lian's heart was a mess right now, so none of Wenlan's words made it through to her head. She simply made a half-hearted tug of her lips in reply. For some reason, when she thought of Changdi's smooth, muscled back being dotted with rod-shaped bruises, her heart felt extremely pained. Chu Lian was already tired beyond belief. She should have fallen deep asleep for a good night's rest. However, the moment she shut her eyes, Chu Lian had a nightmare about Changdi being beaten by rods. In the dream, the perpetually cool and collected Sanlang didn't even make a sound as the rods struck blow after blow to his back. He simply stared at her until the punishment was done. Then, he stood up and showed his bloody back to her, forcing her to look at his once smooth, unmarred skin, now a messy canvas of bruises and blood. Only after she had gotten an eyeful did Sanlang finally turn his head and meet her gaze, smiling at her with deep affection. Look and see, Chu Lian, this is all your fault. You better take responsibility for it. Chapter 307, Sima Hui, 1. Chu Lian was so frightened by the weirdness of Changdi that she subconsciously picked up the teacup by her side and threw it at him. Changdi fell to the floor with a grunt and Chu Lian anxiously ran over. When she checked his nose, she realized he had stopped breathing. Chu Lian screamed and sat up in fright. When Wenqing heard the noises from within the room, she quickly pushed open the doors and entered. The sight that met her eyes was Chu Lian sitting up in bed, eyes dazed as she panted for breath. Her hands were tightly clenched in the blankets. Wenqing was shocked. She walked up to the bed and asked with concern, "Third young madam, what happened?" Chu Lian hadn't thought that her movements would wake Wenqing, who had been sleeping in the outer room. When she recalled the scene in her dreams, she waved her hand in embarrassment. "It's nothing, it was just a bad dream." Wenqing saw that third young madam seemed to have suffered a fright. She touched Chu Lian's forehead and found it was full of sweat, so she brought another pillow over and placed it at the head of the bed before helping Chu Lian to lie against it. Wenqing tried to comfort her. "Third young madam, you must have been disturbed by what happened these past 2 days. Please rest for a while, this servant will bring you a bowl of sweet soup." Chu Lian nodded. When she thought back to that dream just now, there was still some lingering fear in her heart, so she quickly shifted her thoughts to other things. In the cold of the winter night, Changdi led his subordinates as they rushed back to the army camp, situated at the outskirts of Liangju city. Even in the early morning on a cold, blustery winter day, the commander's tent was already lit up with lanterns from within. The highest commander of the northern border troops, Great General Qian, was seated at the head of the table. Below him were the high-ranking leaders of the border troops, and Captain Guo was amongst them. The sound of hoofbeats resounded from outside the tent, followed by a chaotic rush of footsteps. The tent flap was lifted by the soldier outside and in the next moment, a bound-bearded man was marched in. Who else could it be but Changdi? Once Sanlang was inside the tent, Great General Qian started scolding him furiously. "Sanlang, you've got some guts. Before you've even managed to finish learning the military tactics I've taught you, you've already managed to copy my stubborn temper. Take him out and give him 30 smacks with the rod before you bring him in again for interrogation." Xiao Hongyu, who had followed them in, turned pale. He sent a pleading look towards Captain Guo. Captain Guo subtly shook his head, indicating for him to keep quiet. How could Xiao Hongyu remain silent in a situation like this? The poison in his system hadn't been cleared yet. These 30 smacks of the rod were going to push him halfway to death's door. They still had to fight a war ahead. How would he be able to fight in such terrible condition? General, please wait. This subordinate has something to report. Great General Chen sneered and swept He Changdi up and down with a look. His gaze finally ended up on Xiao Hongyu. Aho, He Sanlang. You're pretty skillful, aren't you? It hasn't been that long since you've joined this camp and you've already made a sworn brother. Which camp are you from? Report your name first. If your report is nonsense, you can share the same punishment as He Sanlang. Xiao Hongyu began to sweat. Since he had already decided to speak out, all he could do was grit his teeth and forge on. He obediently reported his camp, which caused General Chen to cast a meaningful look at Captain Guo. Little Guo, very well done. These brats are all from your camp. Captain Guo could feel his head going numb upon hearing those words. He had the urge to kill those 2 brats on the spot. Following that, Xiao Hongyu reported the events of the past few days truthfully, the barbarians and Tu Hun's ambush, as well as how He Sanlang had gotten poisoned. After he finished speaking, he knelt down with his head lowered, obediently waiting for his punishment. General Chen's expression abruptly changed upon hearing all this. What did you say? The Tu Hun soldiers have invaded the lands of our great Wu? The Tu Huns couldn't have appeared in that forest for no reason. There must be something driving them to go there. General Chen's thick brows furrowed together. After thinking for a bit, he waved his hand and ordered He Changdi to be brought in for further questioning. In the end, with Captain Guo helping them plead for mercy, He Changdi was subjected to only 25 smacks of the rod, while Xiao Hongyu received 10. This was also the reward that General Chen was giving He Changdi for his good deed in the face of his crimes. At the same time, the border troops were in desperate need for every able man right now. Otherwise, the strict General Chen wouldn't have let the 2 of them off so easily. He had even broken his own nephew's leg before, let alone some unrelated brats like He Changdi and the rest. In the last 2 days, the Tu Huns had stopped their ambushes and attacks on the city, giving the northern border troops a breather. The injured He Sanlang and Xiao Hongyu were carried into their tent to settle down. Right as the 2 of them had just laid down, Captain Guo and Zhong Mai entered the tent. Captain Guo walked over and stood by the simple wooden bed, looking down at He Changdi from above. So how was it? Has your wife come to the border? He Sanlang was stunned. He hadn't expected Captain Guo to ask a question like this out of the blue. He looked up at his former commanding officer and made a sound of agreement. Captain Guo burst out into laughter and patted his shoulder forcefully. You brat. Those 20+ smacks were well deserved. Lying in the bed next to He Sanlang's, Xiao Hongyu couldn't resist interrupting. Captain, Brother Zhong, I managed to meet sister-in-law this time. I didn't expect sister-in-law to be such a looker considering our He Sanlang's bearded face. She's like a fresh flower wasted on a piece of cow dung like this. Why couldn't I be that lucky? He Changdi's expression completely darkened after hearing so. Who could have thought that the famed pretty boy He Sanlang would one day be compared to cow dung? Chapter 308, Sima Hui, 2. As He Changdi's face turned more and more stiff, in order to stop these people in the tent from blurting out any more earth-shattering revelations, he reached out to his side, picking up a package and tossing it to them. Zhong Mai caught it smoothly and opened it. When he saw the beef jerky he had been longing for day and night within, his eyeballs almost fell out with how wide he opened his eyes. You lucky brat. It's not safe out here in the northern border. Make sure your family's soldiers protect sister-in-law properly. Zhong Mai immediately tore open the oil paper packaging wrapped around the beef jerky. He Changdi kept a serious expression on his face as he said, Brother Zhong, you're older than me by a whole generation. It's not really appropriate for you to call her older sister-in-law like Hongyu does. After so many years spent in the army, Zhong Mai was already as thick-skinned as he could possibly get. How would He Changdi's mild provocation bother him? He chuckled and said, He Sanlang, you have a higher ranking position than me now, so it's proper for me to call your wife older sister-in-law. Captain Guo and Zhong Mai sat down by He Changdi's bedside, munching happily on the goods they had been given. Xiao Hongyu was rather sharp-eyed. His brows drew together as he suddenly recalled what he had seen while getting carried in on a stretcher. Brother Guo, did my eyes deceive me? I seem to have seen a woman while I was being carried in just now. After Xiao Hongyu mentioned that, Captain Guo and Zhongmai abruptly stopped wolfing down their food and let out similar constipated expressions, as if they had been forced to swallow a few kilograms of flies. Oh, her. Captain Guo scratched his head. He didn't know how to explain this. That female general had just arrived in the camp 2 days ago. Furthermore, she seemed to be trusted by General Chen. When Zhongmai saw that Captain Guo didn't know how to explain, he cut in. Zhixiang, Hongyu, you guys should have heard of the Sima family, right? He Changdi, who lived in the capital and socialized in noble society, knew a little more than Xiao Hongyu did. The Simas should be that rich and influential family in Shandong? Zhongmai nodded and continued speaking. The Simas of Shandong have been around for thousands of years and can be traced back to the Great Xia dynasty. In the last dynasty, there were plenty of Simas working as court officials. Later on, when this new dynasty was founded, the Simas of Shandong started moving away from politics. Some people say that it's because the Simas lost too many talents during the changing of the dynasties. Others say that it's because the Simas don't want to stand out too much during the early stages of this dynasty, so they're hiding their abilities. Zhongmai paused before continuing again. That female general you saw today, she's called Sima Hui. She's from one of the Sima's branch families. Although you might not recognize her name, you should have heard of Sima Feng at least, right? Xiao Hongyu replied first. Of course I know about Sima Feng. He was one of the border generals of the previous dynasty. Unfortunately, he was betrayed by his most trusted adjutant in the end and died at the feet of the Russians. He passed away filled with hatred. Zhongmai nodded in agreement. That Sima Hui in our camp, she's Sima Feng's legitimate granddaughter. Xiao Hongyu was so shocked that his jaw had dropped. She's actually one of old General Sima's descendants. As far as I know, the main branch of the Simas didn't support Sima Feng at all. They even fought with Sima Feng's branch of the family. All of Sima Feng's male descendants entered the army and most of them died on the battlefields. By the time it reached Sima Hui's generation, there were only the old, weak, women and children left. Sima Hui practically grew up in the army. Without caring about her family's objections, she bravely enlisted in the army. This time, she was the one who brought the Shandong troops over as support. Xiao Hongyu's cheeks were a little flushed from embarrassment. So that girl turned out to be so impressive. I've underestimated her. Although He Changdi's expression was calm, his mind was racing. He hadn't participated in the war against the Tuhuns in his past life, and he hadn't heard of someone like Sima Hui before, either. Had the natural course of events changed, or were there other secrets behind this anomaly? Captain Guo harumphed. Don't judge her for being a woman. She's one of the fiercest generals in our army. She's already led soldiers for 5 to 6 years, and she's more experienced than a greenhorn like you. General Chen trusts her ability enough to place her in important positions. The shape of Zhongmai's mouth suddenly formed into a slight leer. Most importantly, General Sima has specially formed a female camp. There are hundreds of female soldiers there. Hearing this, Xiao Hongyu's eyes were about to pop out. What? Female soldiers? Women can be soldiers too? Don't tell me they're. Hihi, Captain Guo gave a resounding smack to the back of Xiao Hongyu's head. General Sima's female camp was made at the personal order of the emperor himself. Stop having all these dirty thoughts in your head all the time. If you lose to that group of female soldiers in the battle against the Tuhuns, I'm going to break your legs. Xiao Hongyu's shoulders immediately shrunk upon being chastised. Captain Guo glared at Xiao Hongyu for good measure before turning to He Changdi. One more thing, General Chen has given orders for you and Hongyu to investigate the area where you met the Tuhuns in the forest. You have to keep this mission a secret, both that it's been given to you and that you're doing it. You can't leave camp too many times, as well. He Sanlang was a little surprised. He hadn't expected Great General Chen to have entrusted this matter to him. It seemed like the events in the commander's tent earlier had just been a show that the general had put on for outsiders. Captain Guo and Zhong Mai stayed in He Sanlang's tent for an hour. As they left, they even forcefully snatched away half of the food that Chu Lian had given to He Sanlang. Xiao Hongyu took pleasure in his loss while lying on the bed next to his. He, brother he. Luckily, I was already prepared for that. I've already hidden all the goodies that sister-in-law gave me. Chapter 309, Useless Money. 1. The corner of He Sanlang's mouth twitched and he immediately turned his head. He really didn't want to talk to a glutton like Xiao Yuhong right now. While Chu Lian had been resting and recovering in that little town close to the border, Tang Yang and the rest of the party had caught up. Although they had been robbed by the barbarians previously, He Changdi had come over with the rescue party just in time, so all of Chu Lian's things were safe. The moment Tang Yang arrived, he heard about how Chu Lian had been attacked by the elite Tuhun soldiers and was astounded. After reassuring Chu Lian a little, he decided not to separate from Chu Lian for the rest of the journey. Even though not everyone in the party had recovered from their wounds, just in case, they only stayed in the small town to rest for 4 days. After 4 days, they set off on their journey again. They still had the winter supplies meant for the northern border troops. The closer they got to Liangju City, the more desolate their surroundings became. When they finally reached the outskirts of the city, Chu Lian stared at the completely devastated Liangju City with disbelief in her eyes. How could be called a city? Any town within the lands of the Great Wu would probably be richer than this city by a few times. The city walls were made of mud when the wind blew, some clods of earth would even get blown off. There were broken walls all over the city and hardly any citizens could be seen. 1 or 2 would scurry by occasionally, their bodies thin and sallow. There weren't many brick houses within the city itself. Most of the houses were made of mud and covered with thatch roofs. Even though it was dusk and about time to cook dinner, the number of houses that had smoke drifting up from their kitchens could probably be counted on one hand. There probably weren't as many citizens living here as there were soldiers in the army stationed outside. Chu Lian had finally seen for herself why the nobles in the capital considered Liangju City a barren land. This area was probably part of the great grasslands of the future. Although there were plenty of mountains and vast tracts of land, the terrible weather conditions and the long winter here just weren't suited for farming. If they headed just a little closer to the inner lands of the Great Wu, the farm fields at the boundaries of Liangju might even be fertile enough to allow for a harvest once a year. However, once they went further north into Liangju, the quality of the earth wasn't enough even to support life. When it came to winter, the surface of the ground would be covered in a thick layer of snow. When it came to spring, after the snows melted away, the ground would then turn into a swamp. Chu Lian looked up at the city wall made of yellow mud bricks. There were 2 soldiers standing up there, their bodies curled up into balls. She couldn't even tell what they were wearing, but she could see that they were shivering up there on the city walls. Chu Lian sighed. Could this fragile wall really stand up to the attacks of the ferocious Tuhuns? Tang Yang was riding on a horse beside her carriage. When he saw that Chu Lian had lifted the curtain of her carriage and that she was looking at the walls, he urged his horse over to her. "Honored lady, are you looking at the yellow mud walls?" Chu Lian cast a sideways glance at him and nodded. The corner of Tang Yang's lips tugged upwards and he spoke with a helpless tone. "Liangju City is located in the north of our Great Wu's territory. You've also seen it on the way here, honored lady. This area is lacking in resources. The court sends a huge sum each year here to reinforce Liangju City's walls, but unfortunately, there hasn't been much effect." Chu Lian was shocked. A huge sum? Then how could that wall possibly be in this state? It looks like it will crumble in one hit. Chu Lian accidentally blurted out her true thoughts. Tang Yang didn't mind and simply continued, "Before we talk about where the money the court sends has ended up, there are other more important reasons behind this. Once you enter the city, you'll be able to see why without any hints from me." Chu Lian hadn't expected him to have held back information at the last moment. Was Tang Yang trying to test her? Chu Lian didn't really mind. She nodded and ordered Manager Qin to lead the carriages into the city. With the Empress Dowager's decree, it was easy enough to enter the city. Trash littered the streets of Liangju. When a breeze blew by, a strange odor drifted up from the ground, giving them the urge to puke. It was clear that no one had come by to clean this place for quite some time. Chu Lian lifted the curtains of her carriage slightly and peeked outside. When she caught sight of the situation outside, her brows furrowed together. Luckily it was winter. If this had been the middle of a hot summer, this would be the perfect breeding ground for diseases and the like. Tang Yang had already sent someone ahead of them to arrange for some place to rest, so they were headed straight there. When they reached their destination, Chu Lian looked up at the simple plaque hung above the courtyard entrance, He Estate. She was then informed that this was the residence of the prefect of Liangju City. The residence looked to be about 3,500 square meters in area. In any other city of the Great Wu, it would only be some rich country man's humble farm abode, but in Liangju City, it was considered one of the best residences around. Although the houses in the estate were also made of mud, at least the outer layer was made of processed earth and the roofs were made of crude tiles instead of thatch. When they came to this street, it was clear that the conditions here were slightly better than that of the other areas of this city. Chu Lian was carried off the carriage by Wenlan. She couldn't put weight on her leg still and she had another 4 to 5 days to go before it was fully healed. Right as she got off the carriage, Chu Lian spotted a half-grown child dressed in furs squatting in the midst of some rubble not too far away. There was a pile of small skins in front of him which seemed like sheepskin. He was currently curled up in the corner of the ruined wall, sneakily glancing their way with his wide eyes, as if trying to guess at the purchasing power of their party. Chu Lian looked right back at him with her lips pressed together. Chapter 310, Useless Money, 2. The half-grown child seemed to have abandoned his original misgivings and came running over with the pile of sheepskins hugged to his body. It was only when he was a little closer that Chu Lian could clearly discern his dirt-covered features. Before the child could reach Chu Lian, he was captured by one of the strong private soldiers and pressed to the ground. Mo Chungue's expression was as dark as usual. Third young madam, the northern border isn't as safe as the inner walls of the capital. If we meet some Tuhun scouts just like the last time, third young master will blame this old Mo again. Wenlan could hear the thorns in Mo Chungue's words, standing as she was next to Chu Lian. She was about to move in front of Chu Lian to angrily defend her, but Chu Lian tugged her back and sent her a look. Wenlan suppressed the anger in her chest and retreated. Chu Lian sent a faint smile towards Mo Chengui. Many thanks to Uncle Mo for the reminder. I'll be careful. Mo Chengui hadn't expected such a reply from Chu Lian, so he didn't have a retort ready. The child wasn't struggling and didn't even seem panicked even though he was being pressed to the ground. He took the chance to shout, "Noble sirs, please have mercy." This humble one only wanted to see if noble sirs could buy these sheepskins. This humble one's mother and sister are about to starve to death and there's no food in our house. Our hope for survival lies solely in these sheepskins in this humble one's hand. Tang Yang ordered one of the guards to investigate. As expected, they weren't able to find anything on the child's body. He nodded towards Chu Lian. After seeing how Chu Lian seemed determined to stick her nose in unnecessary business, Mo Chengui snorted and turned to enter the He Estate first. Out of sight, out of mind. Chu Lian pointed at one of the rolls of sheepskin. Bring that over to me and let me have a look. Manager Qin personally bent over to pick up the sheepskin. He examined it carefully before holding it up respectfully with both hands for Chu Lian. Chu Lian casually flipped it over and looked at it for a moment. There was nothing special about it, really. The hide was taken from a normal sheep commonly reared by the northern herdsmen and barbarians. There were even some spots on it, and its color was slightly dark. It looked like it had seen some regular use at home. If not for the fact that their household was in dire straits, they probably wouldn't have taken out their own sheepskins to sell. Her gaze landed on the child next. His clothes were tattered and torn. Some form of beast fur was wrapped around him haphazardly. His arms were exposed from the elbow down and his 2 hands were red from the icy cold. Judging by the child's pitiful appearance, Chu Lian didn't even have to think further to decide that his story was true. She spoke to Wenlan for a bit and Wenlan nodded. She took out a small piece of silver from her own purse and walked over to the child who was still being held down by their family's soldier. She said to him, "Child, our master will buy all of your sheepskins. This is a silver tael for the sheepskins. Next time, don't rush out so recklessly to hold back other nobles. Our master is kind and won't do anything to you, but not everyone is like our master, so take care of yourself." The silver ingot was worth at least 500 to 600 copper coins, 3 or 4 times that of the market price for the sheepskins in the child's hands. Wenlan placed the silver tael in front of the child and ordered the soldier to release him. She then turned around, preparing to help Chu Lian into the He estate. However, just as she turned around, the newly released half-grown child grabbed onto her leg and pleaded, "Big sister, this humble one doesn't want silver. Please, change it into food for this humble one." Wenlan suffered a shock and almost kicked the child away out of instinct. She turned around helplessly and got a guard to help pull the child away. A trace of unhappiness could be seen in the wrinkles between her brows. "You little brat, how could you be so shameless? Do you think that our master offered you too little? This silver tael is enough to buy your sheepskins 3 or 4 times over. No, this humble one doesn't think it's too little. This humble one begs big sister to give just a few wheat pancakes." After saying so, he turned to Wenlan and kowtowed as if his life depended on it. Wenlan was completely stunned. She couldn't believe that someone would rather have a few copper coins worth of wheat pancakes rather than a silver tael worth a few hundred of those coins. Was this child silly in the head? Chu Lian watched the situation before her with furrowed brows. Tang Yang directed a meaningful gaze at her with the shadow of a smile. Suddenly, a light bulb lit up in Chu Lian's mind. She turned to Wenlan and said, "Wenlan, get him some food." Although Wenlan found it strange, she still followed the order. The half-grown child took the 3 cold and hard steamed buns that Wenlan passed to him, his face full of unconcealed joy. He quickly stuffed them into his shirt before looking carefully around him. Only then did he kneel down and bow towards Chu Lian before taking off and disappearing around the corner of a small alleyway. Chu Lian watched the child disappear before ordering the party to get settled into the estate. Her leg was wounded, so she walked very slowly with the support of Wenqing and Wenlan. Tang Yang was able to catch up in just a few steps. He smiled and asked, "Do you know the reason now, honored lady?" Chu Lian smiled bitterly. How could she not? After that little incident with the child, it was impossible not to understand the reason. She sighed lightly and replied, "What Liangju City lacks isn't money. It's material goods." Tang Yang nodded, "How smart, honored lady. In Liangju City, many of the areas here still used the most basic way of trading, barter. Here, the currency most commonly used wasn't gold nor silver, or even copper coins. Most of the time, the people here used cows, sheep, or other livestock, as well as cloth, food, and salt. In the eyes of the commoners of Liangju City, a silver ingot that could buy them 50 kilograms of white rice in the capital wasn't worth as much as a single piece of hard wheat pancake. No wonder the walls of Liangju City were still so dilapidated despite the funds the Ministry of Revenue sent for renovation year after year. Even before considering the cuts taken from officials going down the chain of command, the amount of goods the funds could purchase was already pitiful the closer one got to Liangju. Not only was there a shortage, but even just looking at the cost of transporting materials to the north, the cost was just too high. Goods? What goods? After all was said and done, the amount of things the funds could buy was close to non-existent. Here, money was practically useless. Chapter 311, Eating Breakfast. 1. Chu Lian shook her head. It was also very hard to transport large amounts of goods into Liangju in the bitter cold of the winter. This also exacerbated Liangju City's dire situation. If not for that, the court wouldn't have been that anxious upon finding out that the Tuhuns were invading the northern border in winter. It wasn't easy to send supplies to the army in the winter in the first place. Now the reinforcements were trapped at the Yuqin Mountains. No wonder the Tuhuns had chosen to attack Liangju at this time. Although Chu Lian was worried, she didn't have any good ideas for now. Since money was useless here at the northern border, The first order of business was most likely to solve the problem of transporting goods. Tang Yang escorted Chu Lian to her designated courtyard before bringing his men over to their own residence. The prefect of Liangju City had been removed from office in the first half of the year. Later on, the position of prefect had been passed down to Great General Qian. There were very few citizens in Liangju and most of them were the troops stationed here. Thus, General Qian had ordered the secretary of the infantry, Sir Wu, to take over the responsibilities of the prefect. As of now, the troops were all stationed in the camp right outside the city. In these extraordinary circumstances, Sir Wu naturally had to return to the camp. Thus, the original estate of Liangzhou's prefect, the He estate, had been empty for quite a few months. General Qian knew perfectly clear what the current state of Liangju City's walls was, because the duty of repairing those broken walls would fall upon the northern border troops every year. That wall couldn't even hold up to any enemy attacks right now. Actually, the real border between the Great Wu and the Tuhuns was a single river called the Sula River. The Sula River was the lifeblood of the grass plains of the north. Right now, General Qian was leading the northern border troops in guarding this natural barrier. Once the Tuhuns passed the Sula River, then it would be the same as opening the doors to Liangju for them. The rest of the plains behind were just a wide expanse of flat land. By then, the Tuhuns would most likely charge right into the Great Wu's territory. One of the first places in their path was the fishing haven, Tianjing Harbor. It could be seen how important it was to guard the Sula River. Chu Lian was helped to a seat on the hearth by Wenlan. The hearth had already been lit by the servants in the estate, so it was nice and warm on top of it. Manager Qin stood in front of her and reported all the news he had been able to dig up about the area. Chu Lian thanked her lucky stars after listening to his report. She considered them lucky for having brought enough supplies here. She had even brought those household wares that she normally used in the Jing'an estate. Thus, their party didn't need to worry about their daily necessities for a while. She was here under the Empress Dowager's decree and the scroll was still with her. The supplies were still with her as well. Although there wasn't much, it was better than nothing. It looked like she had to find a chance to visit the camp of the border troops. However, it was better to discuss it with Tang Yang within the next 2 days before deciding on any action. The northern border was bitterly cold. Although the He estate was already considered one of the best residences around in Liangju City, once she left the warm hearthbed, Chu Lian still felt frozen. Even the two siblings trained in martial arts, Li Xing and Li Yu, were wrapped up like huge balls, let alone Chu Lian. Chu Lian rested her leg for another 2 days before she could finally put some weight on it and walk slowly. In the morning, Chu Lian sent someone to bring Tang Yang here. The people of the Great Wu dynasty put emphasis on etiquette and appearances. Although Tang Yang was from Shandong, where the people weren't as strict on upkeep, after staying in the capital for so long, he had long become accustomed to the styles of the capital. This morning, upon waking up and finding that he had grown a layer of stubble, he had gotten his manservant to bring him a razor and conscientiously shaved it all away. The guards serving him had also taken this chance to shave their facial hair as well. Once he stepped out of his house, he felt both refreshed and clean, so he was in a very good mood. On this trip to the north, due to the urgency of the matter, Chu Lian had only brought her 2 martial arts-trained maidservants, Wenqing and Wenlan, with her. Even if they counted the female guard Li Yu in their number, there were just 4 women in the whole party, including Chu Lian. The remaining servants, regardless of whether they did the sweeping, washing or cooking, were all men. There were only 2 door guards in the He estate, and they were older, wounded soldiers. Right now, the entire estate was pretty much all male. Chu Lian had gotten up from bed early in the morning. Tang Yang came early as well. When he saw Wenqing bringing breakfast in, he shamelessly asked Wenqing for his own portion. Chu Lian was a lady after all, so he still wasn't thick-skinned enough to come over and scrounge a meal from her every day. Thus, Tang Yang had specially come at this time to get some breakfast. How could Chu Lian not see through this foodie's line of thought? She didn't expose him and simply nodded towards Wenqing. The moment she looked up and noticed the good mood that Tang Yang was in, she was a little surprised, but a moment later, a trace of admiration flashed through her eyes. Tang Yang was just 26 this year. He couldn't quite be compared to the top-notch looks of He Sanlang or Prince Jin, but without them around, his appearance could be considered above average. His nose bridge was especially high and his eyelashes were thick and dark. He must have specially shaved away his stubble today, so he gave off a clean and gentle feel, making him a little more of a feast for the eyes. Who didn't like beautiful things? Chu Lian looked at Tang Yang with pure, innocent admiration. Her eyes turned to Prince Jin's guards standing not too far behind Tang Yang as well. Chapter 312, Eating Breakfast, 2. The guards were dressed in flared black robes with grey rat fur cloaks. Each of them was tall and their bodies seemed to brim with strength thanks to their years of martial arts training. Adding on their clean faces, just like Tang Yang's, the group of men made for a nice spectacle. Wasn't there a saying that went something like, "Women put on makeup to show respect to others"? These men before her had taken the time to clean up and dress well, and that was a similar form of respect. Chu Lian suddenly felt that the customs of the Great Wu dynasty weren't too bad. She praised them unreservedly. Sir Tang is quite the spectacle today. Who didn't like praise? Even Tang Yang wasn't exempt from this. On the way here, Tang Yang had already become familiar with Chu Lian. He understood that there was no other meaning to her words and that she was purely praising him for his looks. He was already in a good mood. The full wash-up he had done this morning was the first time he had taken a bath this whole trip. Washing off all the dirt and detritus of a long journey could always make anyone feel refreshed. Getting this unexpected praise lifted up his mood by a bit more. Tang Yang was about to speak up when a cold snort sounded from the entrance. Following that, a low, magnetic and cool voice resounded in the room, practically forming icicles. "What a way with words you have, Liana." Once the voice finished speaking, Chu Lian stared at the entrance in astonishment. He Changdi was standing there stiffly behind the felt curtain covering the entrance. Behind him was the anxious yet helpless Wenlan. More than half of his face was covered by his thick facial hair, so she couldn't tell what his expression was like. However, massive waves seemed to be rippling in those narrow eyes of his. Chu Lian felt as if she might be overcome by one of these waves in the blink of an eye. Chu Lian frowned as she stared at him. His appearance at this time was completely out of her expectations. There were a few snowflakes on He Sanlang's shoulders and his tied-up hair was a little messy. His tough armor was looking a little worn out and dirty as well. His thick army boots were covered in mud and snow. He Changdi's wretched appearance was a huge contrast when set against the clean and neat appearance of Tang Yang and his group. Just now, if Wenlan hadn't noticed the huge beard that had become his trademark, she might not have realized that this was her very own master. Chu Lian stood up and walked slowly in He Sanlang's direction. "Why have you come at this time?" It was just a normal question, but it sounded like disdain for his presence to He Sanlang's ears. His expression turned even darker. The corner of his lips tugged downwards. "What? Liana doesn't welcome husband back?" Chu Lian tilted her head to one side and looked carefully at He Changdi. She could detect that trace of unhappiness in He Sanlang's words. Was this guy going on a bend again? If she remembered correctly, they hadn't even met these few days. She couldn't possibly have made him mad again, right? Hadn't they been just fine the last time when he had left? However, Chu Lian was already completely used to He Sanlang's bipolar attitude. This time, her emotions remained unchanged. When she heard his words, she only smiled and didn't reply. Tang Yang stood up at this time and greeted He Changdi. Even though there was practically no relation between He Sanlang and Tang Yang and they were acquaintances at most, when He Changdi looked at the barefaced and neatly dressed Tang Yang at this moment, a strange feeling of dissatisfaction rose in his heart. Tang Yang hadn't interacted much with He Changdi and they had only met at Prince Jin's estate once or twice. He generously explained the reason he had come to find Chu Lian today to He Sanlang. He Changdi took in a quick breath to calm his emotions and nodded in acknowledgement. He sat down assuredly at the table. At the moment he sat down, he gritted his teeth forcefully to bear with the pain on his buttocks. Chu Lian didn't mind at all. Since the last time when she had inadvertently overheard Mo Chungue's words, she had been absent-minded these few days. Now that she was finally meeting him again, The attention that she had originally placed on Tang Yang and Prince Jin's guards was completely drawn to him. She wanted to ask He Sanlang whether he had been punished or not, but with Tang Yang still around, it wasn't the right time for her to ask. She could only sit at the table together with He Changdi. At this time, Wenqing came in with breakfast. To her surprise, third young master had come. After she bobbed in greeting, she placed the food on the table. Today's breakfast was fried spring rolls and shredded chicken and mushroom porridge. When Tang Yang saw the food, his eyes lit up. He picked up a pair of chopsticks. "Honored lady, third young master I won't stand on ceremony with you then. I'll start first." Once he was done speaking, he immediately started wolfing down food. Chu Lian picked up her own spoon and lowered her head to have a sip of porridge. She was about to ask whether He Changdi had had breakfast yet, but in the next second, the spoon in her hands was stolen by him. Chu Lian could only watch as that fellow used her own spoon, right before her very eyes, and dug her up a spoonful of porridge from her bowl and stuffed it into his mouth. Chu Lian was absolutely stunned. That He Sanlang. That was her breakfast. Wasn't he being overly familiar with her? She glared at him with wide eyes, completely forgetting to speak. Her eyes were filled with the scene of He Changdi gulping down her breakfast voraciously. His movements were even faster than Tang Yang's. When she looked at how the two men eating, she was seriously questioning whether they were really nobles from the capital. It was Wenqing who reacted first. "Third young madam, please wait. This servant will get another bowl for you." Chu Lian pursed her lips and could only nod. By the time Chu Lian's new bowl of porridge was served up, the spring rolls on the table had disappeared into thin air. He Sanlang kept count inwardly. He had eaten one more spring roll than Tang Yang. With that result, his mood became much better. He set down his chopsticks and looked at Tang Yang. Tang Yang had already sensed He Changdi's disdain towards him by now. Since he had already eaten the gourmet food he had come for, there was no other reason for him to stay. Thus, he bid them goodbye. "Third young master honored lady, why don't you discuss it between yourselves first? Once you've decided, just send someone to inform this subordinate. TL note, food porn is back again. I've been into porridge lately. It's so easy to eat and feels healthy. I love adding fried anchovies in my porridge. You equals mushroom and chicken porridge with fried anchovies." Chapter 313, Too Few Servants. 1. Chu Lian usually didn't eat much, so she quickly set down her bowl and chopsticks. However, He Changdi ate 3 whole bowls of porridge. After Tang Yang left, Wenqing ushered out all the other people from the room and even kindly shut the door on her way out, giving the couple some room. When Chu Lian saw that He Changdi had finally set down his chopsticks, she awkwardly tried to make conversation. "How's your wounds?" As she said so, Chu Lian's gaze darted towards He Changdi's lower half. He Sanlang's body froze and immediately realized what Chu Lian was asking. The back of his ears flushed red out of sight underneath his hair, even as his visible expression remained as cold and stiff as ever. When he parted his lips, it took him a moment before he was finally able to spit out, "What do you mean by that? I wasn't wounded at all. The poison from last time has already been flushed out as well. You don't have to worry about me." After spending a few days together, Chu Lian had already figured out a little of He Changdi's personality. When she heard his reply, the corners of her mouth twitched. This lunatic He Sanlang really preferred suffering to losing face. She had already gotten confirmation from Mo Chenggui that He Sanlang would definitely get smacks of the rod as punishment. There was no need for him to hide it from her. However, Chu Lian didn't expose He Sanlang's lies. She simply turned around and retrieved a thin white porcelain bottle, placing it in front of He Changdi. "This is some wound salve that I brought from the capital. Grandmother has used it before and says it's even better than the medicines from the palace." He Changdi could feel the burning in his ears spread down to his neck. He couldn't meet Chu Lian's eyes as he said, somewhat stiff, "My body's just fine. What are giving me medicine for? Are you trying to curse me into getting injured?" Chu Lian was amazed yet again by He Changdi's special brand of lunacy. She was clearly being nice and giving He Changdi some of the medicine that great Dr. Miao had specially prepared for her. It was fine if he didn't want it, but he even accused her of cursing him. Chu Lian's expression turned dark. If you don't want it, then at least bring it back to camp and give it to one of your brothers there. There'll surely be need of this kind of ointment in an army camp. After hearing Chu Lian say so, He Changdi had nothing to retort. He took the bottle of ointment and stuffed it into his shirt. Although his expression remained as cool and calm as ever, a small trace of sweetness suffused throughout his heart. How could Chu Lian have expected He Sanlang to be such an awkward, outwardly cold yet inwardly passionate man? The guilt she had been carrying all this time finally dissipated after giving him the ointment. She turned their conversation back to business. He Sanlang, my trip here was a little hurried, so I didn't have the chance to explain everything to you beforehand. I personally made the trip to the northern border not just because our family is worried about you, but because there's another important task at hand, to search for the missing ingredient to cure Mother's illness. He Changdi's heart had been thumping a little harder before, thanks to Chu Lian's actions. Now that he had heard the truth of the matter straight from Chu Lian's mouth, his heart abruptly froze. As good as he was at concealing his emotions, this was a matter concerning his beloved parents. He couldn't restrain the astonishment and shock he felt. Chu Lian just happened to catch sight of his exposed emotions and inwardly relaxed. So the He Changdi who had always appeared cool and uncaring wasn't actually a heartless person. He also had people he cared about. With those emotions in his eyes, he finally seemed like a living person. He Sanlang met Chu Lian's gaze straight on. He looked like he was trying to stare into her soul. He didn't dare miss a single trace of emotion in her own pair of eyes, as if he could discern whether Chu Lian was telling the truth just by what he saw. Although He Changdi had only allowed his emotions to surface for a very short period of time, that was enough to show how uneasy he was. However, he calmed down quickly. So what you're saying is that you found a doctor who can cure Mother's illness? As far as he knew, there was only one doctor who could cure his mother's illness, Great Dr. Miao. Had Prince Jin already found Great Dr. Miao? He had only told Prince Jin about this matter, no one else. Furthermore, due to the ongoing war in the north, he hadn't received any letters from Prince Jin for some time. The depths of He Sanlang's eyes seemed steeped in darkness as he glanced at Chu Lian in doubt. Chapter 314, Too Few Servants, 2. Chu Lian felt rather strange being stared at him like that, but she still answered as if nothing was wrong. Yes, that doctor's surname is Miao. What he needs is the Snow Mountain Mist's flower from Mount Arming. There's only 2 months left before the Snow Mountain Mist's flower blooms. He Changdi didn't ask further. He sunk into thought instead. On their wedding night, he had made sure to test Chu Lian to see if she had reincarnated along with him. Though his tests had proven that she hadn't, now he was a little unsure. Prince Jin had written to him about all the things that Chu Lian had done in the capital. Turning the tables at the Dingyuan estate, saving royal Princess Duanjia, winning the competition in the palace, and even having old Duke Zheng owe her one. Right now, it seemed very possible that she had been the one to find Great Dr. Miao, not Prince Jin. All these things added together were just too much of a coincidence. He refused to believe that someone could have such luck. He Changdi's eyes swept over Chu Lian's face in a seemingly casual glance, but behind the front, he was trying to probe the truth out of her. Her eyes were wide and moist. When her eyes met his, there was a trace of confusion. He Changdi choked as the thoughts in his mind raced about. He remembered vividly how the past Chu Lian had looked at him mocking, full of disdain, contempt. These were clearly the same pair of eyes, but he couldn't see any shadow of the past Chu Lian in them. He Sanlang was completely confused and disconcerted. He shut his eyes and recovered his calm. No matter what, in this life, Chu Lian had risked her life to come to the northern border. Her mission to find the missing ingredient for his mother's cure was real. This matter, if she really succeeded, he was going to owe Chu Lian a huge favor. Right now, the war at the border is more pressing. However, you don't have to worry about it. I'll wait for a suitable time. Even if I don't go there myself, I'll arrange for someone to find that missing ingredient for Mother at Mount Arming. Chu Lian nodded in agreement before starting a discussion about when she should visit his camp to hand over the supplies she had brought. Once the two of them had decided on a time, they both sunk into silence. Chu Lian felt a little awkward sitting at the table like that, but he Changdi's but seemed to have taken root on the chair. He didn't mention leaving at all. He even leaned against his chair with his eyes gently shut. However, they opened up to glance at her from time to time. Chu Lian was so uncomfortable getting looked at like that she scrambled for a topic to make small talk with. Is it okay for you to leave camp like that? The meaning behind her words was that they had already finished discussing business. Why wasn't he leaving yet? Don't worry, I left under orders for another task. It's still early right now, so I'll leave after lunch. Chu Lian hadn't thought he Sanlang would be staying that long. And he was intending to eat here as well? She was slightly taken aback and blurted, "You're staying for lunch?" He Changdi had originally been leaning back in his chair, eyes shut as he rested. Upon hearing Chu Lian's question, his eyes immediately snapped open and locked onto her. What? Can't I stay? Chu Lian didn't dare to say no, of course. He was her husband after all, and if not in feeling then at least in name. She had no right to object even if he wanted to stay the night with her, let alone have a simple midday meal. With that conclusion in mind, Chu Lian had no more qualms left to mention. She shook her head and said, "Since you're staying, what would you like to eat for lunch? I'll get Wenqing to prepare whatever you want to eat." Actually, ever since they had escaped from the mountain forest together, the relations between them had improved significantly. Chu Lian wasn't a calculative person by nature, either. With her straightforward and honest manner, this young pair was starting to look like a sweet couple in love. He Changdi hadn't expected Chu Lian to ask him what he wanted to eat. A trace of warmth suffused through his heart. However, he was too accustomed to being stubborn at this point and refused to soften his words. In the same cold attitude as he usually had, he said, "Vegetables." Almost immediately after saying that, he Sanlang regretted it. Actually, he was fine with eating anything. There was a severe lack of resources in the north. The best meal he could get in his camp was just some wheat pancakes dipped in an ordinary sauce. Where would vegetables come from? There wasn't even any out in the wild to scavenge, never mind a market to buy them from. This bitterly cold winter ensured no one saw even a lick of green. Vegetables had been off the table ever since the middle of autumn. Chapter 315, Too Few Servants, 3. Even in the capital, the only one who got to eat green vegetables in the middle of winter was the imperial family. Those were specially grown in the fields near the imperial-owned hot springs. Even so, the fields were so small that the harvest produced from them was overwhelmingly precious. Only the emperor, empress, and empress dowager could have any. There were no shares left, not even for the princes and princesses. Some time ago, one of the noble madams of the capital, Madame Guo, had been feeling unwell, so the imperial palace had sent a few kilograms of green vegetables as a show of favor. Even though those bunches of spinach had already been beginning to wilt, Madame Guo had flaunted the fact within her social circles for quite some time. He Sanlang was about to change his request when Chu Lian nodded and replied with a resounding, "Okay." This time, it was He Changdi's turn to lose his calm. "Did you hear what I said correctly?" Chu Lian found it strange. Her ears were working just fine and were actually pretty sensitive. Of course she heard him right. She and He Sanlang always spoke in Mandarin to each other, and they weren't using any dialects, either. How could she have misunderstood him? Furthermore, she didn't think that wanting to eat vegetables in the winter was an outrageous request. In the modern world, eating fresh, green vegetables at this time of year was pretty normal, wasn't it? You said vegetables just now, right? Did I hear wrongly? He Changdi was stunned. After a moment, he gulped and said, "You, have some?" Chu Lian nodded and made a millimeter sound in agreement. She had known about the lack of resources in the north before coming here, so she had gotten senior servants Gui and Zhong to lead a group of maidservants to dry plenty of vegetables. She had brought all sorts of them with her. Dried vegetables were not only easy to keep, they didn't take up much space, either. They were also extremely convenient to prepare. All she had to do was to place them in warm water and wait for them to soften. Although they couldn't compare to fresh vegetables in taste, The amount of nutrients in them was about the same. Since they were already in the north, she couldn't be too picky about not having fresh ingredients. When He Sanlang heard Chu Lian's affirmative millimeter, saliva began to pool in his mouth without his control. It couldn't be helped. He hadn't eaten any vegetables in months. Due to the lack of vitamins in his diet, he had even grown a few ulcers in his mouth. Since the two of them had common topics to talk about, the atmosphere wasn't as awkward. Chu Lian noted his wretched appearance and made a suggestion. Since you're only leaving after lunch, why don't I get Wenlan to boil some water so you can take a bath? Since the day she had inadvertently overheard Mo Chungue's words, she had specially gone to look for Huang Zhijian to learn more about what it was like in the army. She was told that it was common for the soldiers to go without bathing for up to a month in the winter, even the officers. When she looked at He Changdi's appearance, she had brought up this suggestion with purely kind intentions. However, in He Sanlang's ears, it sounded like something else. The words of praise that Chu Lian had given Tang Yang resounded in his mind. What? Did this wicked woman think he was dirty? He Sanlang gritted his molars and harumphed in his heart. As dirty as he might be, he was still her husband. She had no other choice. If Chu Lian were to find out about his twisted line of thought, she would surely start to curse at him. She was just offering him a bath out of the kindness of her heart. Wasn't he too good at leaping to conclusions? When He Sanlang thought back to those young, fit guards by Tang Yang's side, the right hand he had placed on the table unconsciously curled into a fist. That Tang Yang. He had abandoned his duties to bring a group of flowery-looking guards over to show off in front of Chu Lian. Let's see who gets the last laugh when I report this to Prince Jin. Chu Lian called for Wenlan and instructed her to start boiling some water. He Sanlang didn't say a word, but he abruptly remembered that Chu Lian had only brought 2 female maidservants to attend to her on this trip. The rest of the people in this courtyard were all men. Thinking back to how that wicked woman liked to admire handsome men, as well as how Tang Yang and his guards had been decked out in their finest, He Changdi immediately felt as if he had swallowed some flies. Wenlan was about to turn and leave after receiving Chu Lian's instructions, when He Changdi added on another order in a dark tone. Bring some middle-aged female servants back tomorrow. It looks like there aren't enough servants here. Chapter 316, Shaving His Beard, 1. Chu Lian felt that He Changdi's mind was just too complicated for her to understand. She had just been asking if he wanted to take a bath. How had the topic switched to buying servants? She rolled her eyes speechlessly. However, Manager Qin had discussed this matter with her 2 days ago, too. When she recalled their conversation, Chu Lian nodded. She was going to stay in Liangju for an indefinite amount of time. Just having Wenqing and Wenlan by her side wasn't enough. Thus, Chu Lian didn't think much of it and agreed. Have Manager Qin go out with some men to search for some suitable people tomorrow, Chu Lian added. Perhaps Chu Lian's quick agreement had helped lessen the frustrations in He Changdi's heart. He sat in the room for a while before leaving to take a bath in the wing that Chu Lian had arranged for him. He Changdi didn't need any attendance for bathing. In his past life, after the He family had fallen into ruin, he had suffered through all sorts of hardships. Even in this life, while living in the northern border camp, he had gotten used to doing everything himself. He removed his dirty clothing, revealing his slender yet muscular upper body. His 8-pack abs were well-defined, a striking V-line at his hips pointed downwards to a bulge in the center. Further down were his long and powerful legs. His long legs carried him into the bathtub in just one stride. The temperature of the water was just right. As his tired body soaked in the warmth of the water, He Sanlang let out a comfortable sigh. He leaned against the side of the tub, his sturdy arms hanging over the edge. Steam rose in front of his face, softening the normally sharp impact of his gaze. He Sanlang's thin lips pressed together as his mind brought up the image of Tang Yang and his guards again. For some reason, he was getting upset. At the time, the smile on that wicked woman's face had been just too dazzling. The hands that He Changdi had slung over the edge of the bathtub were starting to tense up again. He suddenly shouted, "Servants! Bring me a razor." This was the wing that Chu Lian lived in, and Chu Lian was in the room right next door. Even she heard He Changdi's shout. She looked up from her book, a little puzzled, before turning to glance at Wenlan, who had just stood up. Wenlan covered up her smile. "Third young madam, this servant will bring the razor to third young master." Hearing so, Chu Lian waved her hand. Wenqing had been in the middle of taking inventory of their things, together with a few other servants. When she noticed a grinning Wenlan walking over to her, she found it strange and asked, "What are you smiling like that for? Did something good happen?" Wenlan waved the razor in her hands, eyes alight as she said, "Third young master wanted this." Wenqing was stunned for a moment, but she immediately realized what the razor was for. She couldn't resist remarking, "I saw that Sir Tang and Prince Jin's guards all shaved this morning." The sisters shared a secret smile before Wenqing pushed Wenlan. All right, don't keep third young master waiting. Hurry up and send it to him." Wenlan quickly left. As Chu Lian was staring at the county's annual records and pondering over a particularly tricky part, a razor suddenly appeared in front of her. Without thinking too much about it, she said, "Wenlan, just send it directly to my husband." However, how could Wenlan possibly dare to do so? She stayed steadfast at Chu Lian's side and said, "Third young madam, it might be better if you send it instead. Third young master has never liked having maidservants serve him ever since childhood." Chu Lian had no choice but to set down the county records in her hands. She thought back to her time in the Jing'an estate. Actually, she really hadn't seen a personal maidservant at Songtao court before, excluding her own. He Sanlang's personal grooming and other trivial chores had always been handled by manservants instead. Thus, she could only take the razor and head to He Sanlang's room herself. The side room wasn't very big. At this moment, steam was billowing up from behind the screen. Chu Lian hesitated as she walked up to it. She could feel a mysterious trace of tension in her heart. She gave her cheeks a light pat before walking in. When she ducked behind the screen, the first thing that Chu Lian saw in the swirling clouds of steam was He Sanlang standing in the bathtub with his back to her, rinsing his body with the warm water in the tub. His long, black hair was let loose across his back and half of it was drifting in the water like strands of seaweed. His back was muscled, yet his skin was white. The alluring line of his body that led up from the lowest part of his back to his waist was half hidden amidst the length of his hair. She almost stopped breathing from the sight. Disregarding everything else about him, He Changdi's figure was perfect. He wasn't so skinny that he looked weak, yet he wasn't overly buff. You could sense a certain aura of solid strength emanating from his body. His nickname of He Sanlang the Fair wasn't undeserved. TL note: would anyone be interested in helping me with a glossary for TMR? I have the beginnings of one, but I need help to fill out all the characters who have appeared so far and their information. Please message me on Discord in the #Transmigrator Meets Food channel if you'd like to help. https://discord. GGUMU8 should. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.